Welcome back to Gaming Lore Meets Peaceful Rest. Tonight, we embark on a musical journey through the lands between, exploring how each boss theme in Elden Ring serves as a haunting requiem for the tragic figures we encounter. Over the next few hours, we'll discover how composer Tsukasa Saitoh and his team crafted melodies that don't just accompany battles, but tell the deepest stories of loss, corruption, and shattered dreams. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the sorrowful symphonies guide you through this melancholic exploration of musical storytelling at its finest. In the shadow of the Erdtree, where golden light once promised eternal order, every note of music carries the weight of 1,000 tragedies. The soundtrack of Elden Ring is not merely background music or epic battle themes designed to pump adrenaline through your veins. Instead, it serves as a musical autobiography of broken souls, each composition carefully crafted to reflect the inner torment, lost nobility, and corrupted grandeur of the beings we face in combat. Understanding how music functions in Elden Ring requires us to first appreciate the fundamental role that tragedy plays in From Software's storytelling approach. Unlike many video games, where boss music serves to make encounters feel epic or intimidating, Elden Ring's compositions are exercises in empathy, asking us to hear not just the power of our opponents, but their pain. Each boss theme is a musical portrait painted in minor keys and diminished chords, revealing the humanity that remains, even in the most corrupted and monstrous forms. The genius of Elden Ring's musical design lies in its ability to transform what could be simple combat encounters into profound emotional experiences. When we hear the opening notes of a boss theme, we're not just being prepared for a difficult fight, we're being invited into the psychological landscape of a being whose existence has been shaped by forces beyond their control, whose current monstrous state represents the end result of cosmic manipulation, family betrayal, or impossible burdens placed upon divine shoulders. The composers understood that in a world where gods can fall and demigods can be cursed, the music needed to reflect not just power, but the tragedy of power misused, the sorrow of potential unrealized, and the melancholy of noble intentions corrupted by circumstance. This philosophical approach to musical composition elevates Elden Ring's soundtrack beyond mere accompaniment into the realm of musical storytelling that rivals the greatest classical compositions in its emotional depth and narrative complexity. To truly appreciate how each boss theme reflects its subject's tragedy, we must first understand the musical language that From Software employs throughout the game. The soundtrack makes extensive use of what musicologists call leitmotif, recurring musical themes associated with specific characters, concepts, or emotions. These leitmotifs weave throughout the game's score like threads in a tapestry, creating connections between different encounters and reinforcing the interconnected nature of the tragedies we witness. The orchestration choices in Elden Ring are particularly significant in conveying emotional meaning. The composers frequently employ what's known as the ecclesiastical or cathedral sound, rich, reverberant arrangements that evoke the feeling of vast, empty spaces, once filled with worship and devotion, now echoing only with the ghosts of former glory. This sonic landscape perfectly captures the post-apocalyptic religious atmosphere of the lands between, where the remnants of divine order struggle against the chaos of the shattering. String sections in Elden Ring's boss themes often carry the emotional weight of the compositions, utilizing techniques like tremolo, pizzicato, and sustained notes that seem to hang in the air like unresolved grief. The violins, in particular, frequently take on an almost vocal quality, as if the instruments themselves are crying out in anguish for the fallen beings they represent. Brass instruments are used sparingly, but effectively, usually reserved for moments that recall former glory or divine authority, making their absence in certain themes all the more poignant. The harmonic language of the soundtrack draws heavily from medieval and Renaissance musical traditions, appropriate for a world that blends fantasy elements with Gothic and Romanesque architectural styles. However, these traditional harmonic foundations are frequently disrupted by dissonance, chromatic passages, and unexpected key changes that that mirror the corruption and chaos that has infected the natural order of the lands between. This musical corruption serves as an auditory metaphor for the way that cosmic forces have twisted the world's fundamental nature. Percussion in Elden Ring's boss themes is used with remarkable restraint and precision. Rather than relying on constant rhythmic driving, the composers use percussion strategically to emphasize specific emotional moments or to represent the mechanical, inexorable nature of fate. Timpani rolls might represent the rumbling of cosmic forces, while delicate bell tones can suggest the fragility of hope in a world dominated by despair. The use of chorus and vocal elements in certain boss themes adds another layer of narrative meaning to the compositions. When voices appear in the music, they often represent the echoes of prayers, lamentations, or the ghostly remnants of communities that once thrived under the protection of the beings we now face in battle. These vocal elements are frequently wordless, allowing the pure emotional expression of the human voice to convey feelings that words cannot adequately express. Now that we've established the musical foundation, let's examine how these techniques are applied to specific boss encounters, beginning with one of the most emotionally devastating themes in the entire game, Godrick the Grafted, a symphony of inadequacy. The musical theme for Godrick the Grafted stands as perhaps the most psychologically penetrating composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. From the moment the first notes begin to play, we are confronted not with the music of a mighty demigod, but with the pathetic strains of a being desperately trying to convince himself and others of his own worthiness. The theme opens with a grandiose gesture, brass instruments attempting to project authority and power, but these opening fanfares immediately collapse into smaller, more hesitant melodic fragments, as if the music itself is struggling to maintain the facade of importance. The central melody of Godrick's theme is built around what musicians call an incomplete or unfulfilled phrase structure, where we might expect bold, confident melodic statements that rise to triumphant climaxes. Instead, we find musical phrases that seem to lose their way mid-sentence, trailing off into uncertainty before starting again with renewed but ultimately doomed attempts at grandeur. This musical structure perfectly mirrors Godrick's psychological state, a being whose every attempt to prove his worthiness only serves to highlight his fundamental inadequacy. The orchestration of Godrick's theme reveals the composer's deep understanding of his character through instrumental choices that emphasize artificiality and desperation. The prominent use of brass instruments, traditionally associated with nobility and military might, is undercut by their placement in uncomfortable registers and their tendency to crack or strain on the highest notes. This creates an auditory representation of Godrick's grafted limbs, powerful in appearance, but fundamentally unstable and likely to fail under pressure. String sections in Godrick's theme employ a technique called false harmonics, where the instruments produce sounds that seem rich and full, but lack the fundamental stability of natural harmonics. This technical choice creates a musical metaphor for Godrick's entire existence. He has assembled the appearance of power and authority, but lacks the essential qualities that would make that power legitimate or sustainable. The strings frequently play in octaves that don't quite align perfectly, creating a subtle but persistent sense that something is fundamentally wrong with what we're hearing. Perhaps most tellingly, Godrick's theme includes several moments where the music seems to quote or reference other, more noble themes from throughout the game, brief snippets that suggest the golden age of his lineage or the true power that his ancestors possessed. However, these quotations are invariably corrupted, played in wrong keys, or interrupted before they can develop into anything meaningful. This musical technique represents Godrick's desperate attempts to claim the legacy of Godwyn the Golden and the other great heroes of his bloodline, while simultaneously revealing the hollowness of those claims. The rhythm section in Godrick's theme is particularly masterful in its portrayal of psychological instability. Rather than maintaining a steady, confident tempo throughout the encounter, the music frequently speeds up and slows down in ways that suggest panic, desperation, and the loss of self-control. During the moments when Godrick grafts the dragon head onto his arm, the music becomes almost frantic, with rapid passages that stumble over themselves in their eagerness to project power, only to collapse back into the hesitant, uncertain patterns that characterize the rest of the composition. The use of percussion in this theme is sparse, but devastatingly effective. When drums do appear, they often play patterns that seem slightly offbeat or out of sync with the rest of the orchestra, creating a sense of musical clumsiness that mirrors Godrick's physical awkwardness. The timpani, when they enter during the dragon phase of the fight, play roles that build toward crescendos that never quite arrive, representing the ultimate failure of Godrick's most desperate gambit to achieve true power. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Godrick's musical theme is how it occasionally hints at what he might have been under different circumstances. There are brief moments, usually lasting only a few measures, where the music achieves a genuine sense of nobility and strength. These passages are invariably brief and quickly overwhelmed by the return of the more desperate and artificial elements. But their very existence suggests that somewhere beneath all the grafted limbs and borrowed power, there might once have been the potential for genuine greatness. The harmonic progression underlying Godrick's theme is built around what classical composers call deceptive cadences, musical phrases that seem to be resolving toward stability and consonance, but instead move to unexpected, unresolved chords. This harmonic technique creates a persistent sense of musical dissatisfaction, as if the theme is constantly reaching for emotional resolution that it can never quite achieve. This perfectly captures Godrick's existential situation. He is always grasping for validation and recognition that remains forever beyond his reach. The dynamic structure of the piece also reflects Godrick's psychological journey throughout the encounter. The music begins with forced bombast, transitions through periods of increasing desperation, reaches a peak of frantic energy during the dragon phase, and ultimately collapses into a diminished, exhausted conclusion that feels less like the end of a great battle and more like the final gasps of a being who has worn himself out in futile attempts to become something he was never meant to be. Listening to Godrick's theme with an understanding of its musical construction reveals the profound empathy that the composers brought to their work, rather than simply creating villain music that would make the encounter feel appropriately boss-like. They crafted a piece that invites us to understand and even sympathize with one of the most pathetic figures in the entire game. The music asks us to hear not just the monster that Godrick has become, but the inadequate, frightened man that he has always been, desperately trying to live up to expectations that were always beyond his capabilities. Margit, the Fell-Omen, Duty's mournful march, the musical theme that accompanies our encounter with Margit the Fell-Omen, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of musical irony in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. On the surface, the composition projects the authority and determination of a stalwart guardian defending the capital city. Yet beneath this facade of strength lies a musical structure that reveals the profound tragedy of a being whose greatest virtue, his unwavering loyalty, has become the instrument of his own destruction. The opening of Margit's theme immediately establishes its central musical contradiction. The piece begins with a martial rhythm played by low brass and percussion, suggesting the steady, inexorable advance of a military force. This rhythmic foundation provides the backbone for what initially appears to be a straightforward boss battle composition. However, the melody that develops over this martial foundation tells a very different story, built around a descending chromatic line that never quite finds resolution. The main melodic theme carries within it a sense of inevitable descent and gradual erosion that undermines the apparent confidence of the rhythmic foundation. The orchestration choices in Margit's theme reveal the composer's deep understanding of his psychological complexity. The heavy reliance on brass instruments, particularly French horns and trombones, evokes the ceremonial music associated with royal courts and military honors. These instrumental choices remind us that Margit, despite his current status as a reviled Omen, is still fundamentally a prince of the royal bloodline, heir to traditions of honor and duty that shaped his entire worldview. Yet these noble brass voices are frequently muted or played with techniques that dampen their natural resonance, creating a sound that suggests glory remembered rather than glory present. String sections in Margit's theme employ a sophisticated technique called kul legno, where the wooden backs of the bows are used to strike the strings rather than drawing them across in the traditional manner. This creates a percussive, almost skeletal sound that evokes both the rhythm of marching feet and the hollow ring of duty performed without joy or hope. The strings frequently play in unison, suggesting the single-minded focus of Margit's devotion to his cause. But this unison playing lacks the warmth and richness that would make it truly inspiring, instead creating a sense of mechanical obligation. The harmonic language of Margit's theme is particularly revealing in its use of what musicologists call picardy thirds, moments where a piece in a minor key suddenly resolves to a major chord, creating a brief moment of unexpected brightness. In Margit's music, these moments of harmonic light consistently appear when the melody references themes associated with the Golden Order or the Erdtree itself. This musical technique suggests that Margit's devotion to these institutions provides him with genuine moments of spiritual elevation and purpose, even as the overall trajectory of his theme remains tragic. However, these bright harmonic moments are always brief and quickly overwhelmed by the return of minor key passages that seem even darker by comparison. This harmonic pattern creates a musical representation of Margit's psychological state. He experiences real joy and meaning when contemplating his service to the Golden Order. But these moments of happiness only serve to highlight the fundamental sadness of his situation. He has devoted his entire existence to serving a system that considers him an abomination, finding purpose and duty that is neither recognized nor appreciated by those he serves. The rhythmic complexity of Margit's theme deserves special attention for the way it represents his internal conflict between his noble intentions and his monstrous nature. The basic pulse of the composition is built around traditional military rhythms, the kind of steady, disciplined beats associated with ceremonial guards and elite soldiers. However, these regular patterns are constantly interrupted by syncopated passages, offbeat accents, and rhythmic irregularities that suggest something fundamentally disrupted in the natural order. These rhythmic disruptions are not random musical choices, but carefully placed elements that coincide with moments in the composition when Margit's Omen nature is most prominently featured, when the music references his horns, his exile, or his status as one of the cursed. The steady martial rhythm falters and stumbles, creating audible representations of the way his curse interferes with his attempts to fulfill his chosen role as guardian of the capital. The music suggests that no matter how disciplined and dedicated Margit might be, his fundamental nature creates obstacles that he can never fully overcome. The use of percussion in Margit's theme creates one of the most emotionally complex soundscapes in the entire game. Traditional military drums provide the foundation for much of the composition, but they are frequently joined by more exotic percussion instruments that evoke the supernatural and otherworldly aspects of his character. Bells, chimes, and metallic percussion create an almost ethereal quality that suggests Margit's connection to forces beyond the purely physical realm. This percussion palette creates a musical representation of his hybrid nature, part royal guardian, part cursed omen, existing in a liminal space between the human and divine worlds. One of the most poignant musical techniques employed in Margit's theme is the use of what classical composers call a walking bass line, a steady progression of low notes that moves step by step, either upward or downward throughout a musical passage. In Margit's case, this bass line consistently moves downward, creating a sense of gradual descent and inevitable tragedy, even during the most heroic and martial sections of the piece. This musical technique suggests that no matter how noble Margit's actions might be, his ultimate fate is sealed by forces beyond his control. The melodic content of Margit's theme frequently employs a technique called sequence, where a musical phrase is repeated at different pitch levels, usually moving higher or lower with each repetition. In traditional compositions, ascending sequences create feelings of hope and triumph, while descending sequences suggest loss and defeat. Margit's theme uses both types of sequences, but they are arranged in a pattern where ascending passages that seem to offer hope are always followed by descending passages that negate that hope, creating a musical representation of the futility of his efforts to earn acceptance through service. Perhaps most remarkably, Margit's theme includes several subtle quotations from what appears to be ceremonial music associated with royal courts and formal state occasions. These quotations are woven so seamlessly into the composition that they might be missed on casual listening, but their presence adds profound emotional depth to the piece. They represent Margit's deep knowledge and appreciation of the courtly traditions he has been excluded from, suggesting that his devotion to the Golden Order is informed not by ignorance of what he has lost, but by intimate understanding of the world that has rejected him. The dynamic structure of Margit's composition follows the psychological arc of his character throughout the encounter. The music begins with quiet determination, builds through passages of increasing intensity as his dedication to his duty becomes more apparent, reaches a climax of tragic nobility during the most challenging phases of the battle, and concludes with a diminuendo that feels less like the end of a conflict and more like the final exhalation of a being who has given everything in service to a cause that can never truly accept him. The overall effect of Margit's theme is to create one of the most emotionally complex boss encounters in gaming history. The music constantly asks us to recognize the nobility of his purpose, while simultaneously mourning the waste of that nobility. We are invited to see Margit not as a monster to be defeated, but as a tragic figure whose greatest strength, his capacity for loyalty and dedication, has become the instrument of his own suffering. The composition serves as a musical meditation on the nature of duty, loyalty, and the price of devotion to institutions that may not deserve the sacrifice they demand. Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, Broken Lullabies. The musical theme for Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, represents perhaps the most heartbreaking use of musical irony in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. What begins as what should be a triumphant encounter with one of the most powerful sorceresses in the lands between, transforms into an exercise in musical empathy that forces us to confront the devastating effects of abandonment and grief on even the mightiest of beings. The composition masterfully employs the musical language of childhood, motherhood, and lost innocence to create a soundscape that turns a boss battle into a lament for a shattered mind and broken heart. The most immediately striking aspect of Rennala's theme is its prominent use of what musicologists call music box instrumentation, delicate, crystalline sounds that evoke childhood toys and nursery melodies. This instrumental choice might seem incongruous for a battle with a powerful demigod, but it serves multiple symbolic functions that reveal the depth of the composer's understanding of her character. The music box sound immediately establishes the connection between Rennala's current obsession with rebirth and her role as a mother figure, while simultaneously suggesting the mechanical, repetitive nature of her attempts to cope with her trauma through magical ritual. The melodic structure of Rennala's theme is built around what can only be described as a corrupted lullaby. The main melodic line follows the simple, stepwise patterns typical of songs designed to soothe children, with gentle rises and falls that mirror the natural rhythm of breathing or the rocking motion of a cradle. However, this soothing melodic foundation is consistently undermined by harmonic progressions that create subtle but persistent feelings of unease and sadness. The result is a melody that sounds familiar and comforting on the surface, but contains within it an undercurrent of profound melancholy that grows more apparent with each repetition. The harmonic language of Rennala's theme makes extensive use of what classical composers call modal scales, ancient musical modes that predate the major and minor key systems that dominate most modern music. These modal scales create a sense of timelessness and otherworldliness that perfectly captures both Rennala's mastery of cosmic sorcery and her psychological retreat from the immediate reality of her situation. The particular modes chosen for her theme evoke both the mystical traditions of lunar magic and the archaic quality of ancient nursery rhymes, passed down through generations. Orchestrationally, Rennala's theme makes remarkable use of what might be called negative space, moments of silence and sparse instrumentation that are just as important as the notes that are actually played. This compositional technique creates a sense of emptiness and loss that reflects the void left in Rennala's life by Radagon's departure. The music frequently builds toward what seem like they should be emotionally climactic moments, only to have the orchestration suddenly thin out, leaving individual instruments isolated and vulnerable, much like Rennala herself has been left isolated by the abandonment of her consort. The string section in Rennala's theme employs a particularly poignant technique called tremolo, where individual notes are rapidly repeated to create a shimmering, almost ethereal effect. This tremolo playing creates a sound that evokes both the magical energy associated with her sorcery and the trembling of someone struggling to maintain emotional control. The violins, in particular, frequently play in their highest register, creating sounds that seem to hover on the edge of dissolution, much like Rennala's sanity hangs by the thinnest of threads. The use of harp in Rennala's composition deserves special attention for the way it creates musical connections to both celestial imagery and domestic tranquility. Harp arpeggios, flowing, cascade-like passages that move smoothly from low notes to high, appear throughout the theme and serve multiple symbolic functions. They evoke the flowing of moonlight, the casting of spells, and the gentle motion of a hand stroking a child's hair. However, these harp passages frequently end on unresolved notes, creating a sense of incompleteness that mirrors Rennala's inability to find peace or closure in her current situation. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Rennala's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of repetition. Throughout the encounter, certain melodic phrases and harmonic progressions return again and again, but with subtle variations that prevent them from becoming truly satisfying. This musical technique creates an auditory representation of Rennala's obsessive behavior, her constant attempts to recreate perfect rebirth through the amber egg, her repetitive casting of the same spells, her mental loops that prevent her from moving beyond her trauma. The music suggests someone trapped in cycles of behavior that provide the illusion of progress, while actually maintaining stasis. The second phase of Rennala's encounter introduces additional musical elements that complicate our understanding of her character. When she appears in her illusory form, surrounded by the magical academy and demonstrating her full power as the Queen of the Full Moon, the music temporarily abandons the music box elements and embraces a more traditionally epic orchestral style. This musical transformation suggests that beneath her current broken state lies the memory and potential of genuine greatness. She truly was one of the most powerful beings in the lands between, capable of commanding cosmic forces and leading one of the great centers of learning and knowledge. However, this more epic musical material is consistently undermined by the return of the lullaby elements from the first phase, creating a musical tension that reflects the conflict between who Rennala was and who she has become. The composition seems to be constantly asking whether the powerful sorceress queen is the real Rennala and the broken mother figure is an aberration, or whether the grief-stricken woman obsessed with rebirth represents her true nature and the displays of cosmic power are merely echoes of a former self that no longer truly exists. The vocal elements in Rennala's theme add another layer of emotional complexity to the composition. While there are no actual lyrics, the orchestration frequently includes instrumental voices that seem to be humming, singing, or even whispering. These pseudo-vocal elements evoke both the incantations of magical spells and the soft songs that mothers sing to their children. The absence of actual words in these vocal passages suggests communication that operates on a level deeper than language. The primal bonds between mother and child, the ancient traditions of magical knowledge, and the wordless grief that follows profound loss. The dynamic structure of Rennala's theme follows an unusual pattern that reflects her psychological state rather than the traditional arc of a boss battle. Instead of building steadily toward climactic moments of intensity, the music tends to ebb and flow like tides, with passages of relative calm giving way to moments of magical power that quickly recede back into quiet contemplation. This dynamic pattern creates a musical representation of someone whose grip on reality and emotional stability is constantly shifting, who can appear lucid and powerful one moment and lost and vulnerable the next. Perhaps most poignantly, Rennala's theme includes several musical passages that seem to quote or reference what might be love songs or wedding music. Brief melodic fragments that suggest the happiness she once knew with Radagon before his departure shattered her world. These quotations are always heavily modified, played in different keys or with altered rhythms that make them sound like half-remembered dreams rather than clear recollections. This musical technique suggests that even Rennala's memories of happiness have become corrupted by her present grief, transformed into sources of pain rather than comfort. The percussion section in Rennala's theme is used with remarkable restraint, appearing only at specific moments to emphasize particular emotional beats in the composition. When percussion does enter, it often takes the form of delicate bells, chimes, or other metallic instruments that create sparkling crystalline sounds, reminiscent of both magical energy and children's toys. This percussion palette reinforces the connection between Rennala's magical power and her maternal instincts, while avoiding any sounds that might suggest violence or aggression inappropriate to her character. The overall effect of Rennala's musical theme is to transform what could have been a straightforward magical duel into a profound meditation on loss, motherhood, and the different ways that powerful beings cope with trauma. The music consistently asks us to see beyond the surface of the encounter, beyond the magical attacks and defensive spells, to recognize the broken heart that drives all of Rennala's actions. We are invited to understand that her obsession with rebirth is not madness, but a desperate attempt to reclaim something precious that has been lost, and that her retreat into fantasy represents not weakness, but a survival mechanism employed by someone who has endured more pain than should be possible to bear. Starscourge Radahn, the last hero's requiem. The musical theme for Starscourge Radahn stands as perhaps the most emotionally devastating composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. A piece that transforms what should be a triumphant battle against a legendary general into a heartbreaking mercy-killing set to music. From its opening notes, Radahn's theme establishes itself not as the soundtrack to a glorious duel between warriors, but as a requiem for the last true hero of the lands between. A musical eulogy for nobility corrupted and strength turned to madness through no fault of its possessor. The composition opens with what can only be described as a memory of fanfare, brass instruments that attempt to sound the traditional calls associated with military honor and heroic achievement, but which carry within their very tone a sense of distance and loss, as if we are hearing these noble sounds echoing from across a vast expanse of time and tragedy. These opening brass statements are harmonized in ways that create subtle dissonances, suggesting that the glory they attempt to proclaim has been fundamentally compromised by forces beyond anyone's control. The main melodic theme of Radahn's composition is built around what musicologists call a heroic mode, a musical scale that has been used since ancient times to evoke feelings of courage, nobility, and larger-than-life achievement. However, the composers have taken this traditionally triumphant musical language and subjected it to a process of gradual decay throughout the piece. The heroic melody begins with clear, strong statements, but becomes increasingly fragmented and distorted as the composition progresses, creating an auditory representation of Radahn's mental deterioration under the influence of the Scarlet Rope. The orchestration of Radahn's theme reveals the profound respect and sympathy that the composers brought to his character. The heavy use of French horns throughout the piece creates a sound that is simultaneously martial and mournful, evoking both the military traditions that shaped Radahn's identity and the tragic circumstances that have led to his current state. These horns frequently play in harmonies that create what classical musicians call open fifths, intervals that sound both powerful and hollow, suggesting strength that has been emptied of its original purpose and meaning. String sections in Radahn's theme employ a technique called sul ponticello, where the bow is drawn across the strings, very close to the bridge of the instrument, creating a sound that is both intense and slightly distorted. This playing technique produces tones that seem to strain against their own nature, much like Radahn himself strains against the corruption that has infected his mind while still attempting to fulfill his cosmic duties. The strings frequently play in unison, suggesting the single-minded focus that allows Radahn to continue holding back the stars even in his madness. But this unison playing has a mechanical, involuntary quality that suggests compulsion rather than choice. The harmonic progression underlying Radahn's theme makes sophisticated use of what classical composers call sequence, a musical technique where a melodic or harmonic pattern is repeated at different pitch levels. In Radahn's case, these sequences consistently move downward, creating a sense of gradual descent and inevitable defeat, even during the most heroically orchestrated passages of the composition. This harmonic technique creates a musical representation of the tragic irony of Radahn's situation. Even his greatest act of heroism, holding back the stars, has become a burden that slowly destroys him from within. Perhaps most poignantly, Radahn's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference ceremonial music associated with military honors, victory celebrations, and the conferring of knighthood. These quotations appear as brief melodic fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where the music seems to remember what Radahn once was, the greatest general of his age, beloved by his troops, respected by his enemies, and admired throughout the lands between for his combination of strength and honor. However, these moments of remembered glory are always brief and quickly overwhelmed by the return of the more tragic musical material that dominates the composition. The rhythm section in Radahn's theme creates one of the most emotionally complex soundscapes in gaming music. The basic pulse of the composition is built around what might be called a limping rhythm, patterns that seem to favor one beat over another, creating a sense of something struggling to maintain forward momentum, despite significant obstacles. This rhythmic choice creates an auditory representation of Radahn's attempts to continue his duties while fighting against the mental and physical corruption that threatens to overwhelm him. Percussion in this theme is used with exceptional sophistication to create multiple layers of meaning. Traditional military drums provide a foundation that evokes Radahn's identity as a general and warrior, but these drums frequently play patterns that are slightly irregular or syncopated, suggesting discipline that is beginning to break down under extreme stress. More exotic percussion instruments, bells, chimes, and metallic instruments, create ethereal sounds that represent the cosmic forces Radahn commands in his battle against the stars, while their delicate, fragile tones serve as a counterpoint to the more martial elements of the composition. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Radahn's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of memory and identity. Throughout the piece, certain melodic phrases seem to emerge from the overall texture, like half-remembered thoughts, playing briefly in clear, beautiful tones before being swallowed back into the more chaotic and distorted material that dominates the theme. These musical moments suggest that somewhere within the corrupted beast that Radahn has become, fragments of his original personality continue to exist, occasionally surfacing like bubbles rising from the depths of a dark lake. The second phase of the Radahn encounter, where players witness him calling down meteors and demonstrating his mastery over gravitational forces, is accompanied by music that temporarily abandons the more tragic elements of his theme in favor of passages that genuinely capture the awe-inspiring nature of his cosmic power. During these moments, the composition achieves a sense of genuine sublimity that reminds us why Radahn was considered one of the mightiest demigods. The music during these passages suggests not madness, but a terrible clarity, the focused application of unimaginable power in service of a purpose that transcends individual suffering. However, even these moments of musical transcendence are tinged with sadness, as the harmonic progressions underlying even the most epic passages continue to move in directions that suggest inevitable tragedy. The music seems to be saying that even Radahn's greatest displays of power are not victories, but final demonstrations of what the world has lost through his corruption. We are witnessing not the triumph of a great general, but the swan song of a hero whose nobility has been perverted into a form of cosmic obligation that offers no possibility of rest or peace. The dynamic structure of Radahn's theme follows the emotional arc of the encounter in ways that maximize its tragic impact. The composition begins with quiet dignity, builds through passages of increasing intensity that mirror the escalation of the battle, reaches climactic moments that feel more mournful than triumphant, and concludes with a diminuendo that feels like the final exhale of a being who has carried impossible burdens for far too long. The ending of Radahn's theme doesn't feel like the conclusion of a boss battle, but like the moment when a wounded animal finally stops struggling and accepts the peace that death offers. Perhaps most remarkably, Radahn's theme includes subtle musical references to what appears to be lullaby music, gentle, soothing melodies that might be associated with childhood memories or moments of peace and comfort. These lullaby elements are woven so subtly into the composition that they might be missed on casual listening, but their presence adds profound emotional depth to the piece. They suggest that beneath all the corruption and madness, some part of Radahn still remembers what it felt like to be safe, loved, and free from the terrible responsibilities that have consumed his existence. The vocal elements in Radahn's theme, while wordless, seem to carry the weight of an entire civilization's grief. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest mourning, lamentation, and the kind of collective sorrow that follows the loss of a great leader. These pseudo-vocal elements create the impression that we are not just witnessing Radahn's personal tragedy, but participating in a moment of historical significance, the end of an era when heroes could exist in the world without being destroyed by the very qualities that made them heroic. The overall effect of Radahn's musical theme is to create one of the most emotionally challenging encounters in gaming history. The music constantly reminds us that we are not defeating a villain, but ending the suffering of a being whose only crime was being too noble to abandon his duties even when those duties became a form of torture. We are invited to see our victory not as a triumph, but as an act of mercy, a final gift to a hero who has earned the right to rest. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, the corruption of noble ideals. The musical theme for Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of musical transformation in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. What makes this composition particularly remarkable is how it tells the complete story of Rykard's fall from idealistic reformer to cosmic horror through musical techniques that mirror his psychological and physical transformation. The theme serves as both battle music and biographical narrative, chronicling the journey from noble intentions to monstrous corruption, with every note carefully chosen to reflect the stages of his descent. The opening of Rykard's theme immediately establishes the musical tension between his human origins and his current monstrous state. The composition begins with what can only be described as legal music, formal, ceremonial melodies that evoke the dignity and authority of courts of law and scholarly institutions. These opening passages are played primarily by brass instruments in measured, stately rhythms that suggest the careful deliberation and rational discourse that once characterized Rykard's approach to justice and reform. However, these noble musical gestures are immediately undermined by harmonic progressions that create subtle feelings of unease and moral ambiguity. The main melodic content of Rykard's theme is built around what musicologists call a chromatic descent, a musical line that moves downward through every available note rather than following the more stable patterns of traditional scales. This chromatic descent serves as a musical metaphor for Rykard's moral degradation, suggesting a process of corruption that proceeds step by inexorable step until the original noble purpose has been completely perverted. The melody begins with clear, confident statements, but becomes increasingly distorted and fragmented as it descends, much like Rykard's ideals became twisted beyond recognition as he pursued ever more extreme methods to achieve his goals. The orchestration of Rykard's theme reveals the composer's deep understanding of his character through instrumental choices that emphasize both his intellectual sophistication and his gradual surrender to primal forces. The prominent use of string instruments, particularly cellos and double basses, creates a rich, dark foundation that evokes both scholarly contemplation and serpentine movement. These strings frequently play in what musicians call tremolo, rapid repetition of individual notes that creates a sense of barely controlled energy, much like the god-devouring serpent's presence within Rykard creates a constant tension between human reason and reptilian hunger. The brass section in Rykard's theme undergoes a remarkable transformation throughout the composition, beginning with the noble, ceremonial sounds associated with legal authority, and gradually adopting the more aggressive, predatory tones that suggest his current monstrous nature. French horns, traditionally associated with heroic music, are played with muted techniques that make them sound distant and corrupted, while trumpets and trombones frequently play in harsh, brassy tones that evoke both the voice of authority and the roar of a great serpent. Perhaps most tellingly, Rykard's theme makes extensive use of what classical composers call counterpoint, the simultaneous presentation of multiple independent melodic lines that weave together to create complex harmonic relationships. In Rykard's case, these contrapuntal passages often present two or more musical ideas simultaneously, with one line representing his original noble intentions, while another represents the serpentine corruption that has overwhelmed them. This musical technique creates an auditory representation of the internal conflict between his human consciousness and the alien intelligence of the god-devouring serpent. The harmonic language of Rykard's theme is particularly sophisticated in its use of what musicologists call modal mixture, the borrowing of chords and progressions from different musical modes to create feelings of instability and moral ambiguity. Traditional major harmonies associated with heroism and moral clarity are frequently mixed with minor and diminished harmonies that create feelings of darkness and corruption. This harmonic technique suggests that Rykard's current state is not a complete abandonment of his original nature, but rather a perversion of it. His noble qualities have not disappeared, but have been twisted into serving evil purposes. The rhythm section in Rykard's theme creates one of the most unsettling soundscapes in the entire game, through its combination of academic precision and reptilian sensuality. The basic pulse of the composition alternates between measured, scholarly rhythms that suggest careful deliberation and more fluid, sinuous patterns that evoke the movement of a great serpent. This rhythmic duality creates a musical representation of Rykard's hybrid nature, part human intellectual, part cosmic predator, while also suggesting the constant internal struggle between these two aspects of his being. Percussion in Rykard's theme is used with exceptional creativity to represent both his scholarly background and his current monstrous form. Traditional orchestral timpani provide a foundation of academic dignity, but they are frequently joined by more exotic percussion instruments that create sounds suggesting scales, coils, and the massive bulk of a serpentine body. Metallic percussion instruments create ringing, resonant tones that evoke both the ceremonial aspects of legal proceedings and the otherworldly nature of the cosmic forces Rykard has embraced. One of the most disturbing aspects of Rykard's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of seduction and temptation. Throughout the theme, certain melodic passages have an almost hypnotic quality, employing musical techniques traditionally associated with lullabies or folk songs to create a sense of comfort and familiarity. These seductive musical elements represent Rykard's ability to attract followers through his charm and apparent reasonableness, drawing them into his orbit with promises of justice and reform, before gradually corrupting them with more extreme ideas and practices. The second phase of the Rykard encounter, where his full serpentine form is revealed and his human head speaks from the creature's neck, is accompanied by music that achieves a remarkable balance between horror and tragedy. The composition maintains the intellectual complexity that characterized the earlier passages, but subjects it to increasingly extreme distortion and fragmentation. Musical phrases that began with scholarly dignity are stretched, compressed, and twisted until they become almost unrecognizable, creating an auditory representation of the way Rykard's noble ideas have been corrupted beyond redemption. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, Rykard's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference academic songs, scholarly anthems, or the kind of ceremonial music that might be played at graduation ceremonies or the founding of institutions of learning. These quotations appear as brief fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where we catch glimpses of the idealistic scholar and reformer that Rykard once was. However, these moments of remembered nobility are always brief and quickly consumed by the more monstrous musical material that dominates the theme. The vocal elements in Rykard's composition deserve special attention for the way they represent his continued ability to speak and reason, despite his physical transformation. The orchestration frequently includes instrumental voices that seem to be arguing, debating, or delivering speeches, creating a musical representation of Rykard's rhetorical skills and his continued belief in the righteousness of his cause. However, these pseudo-vocal elements are consistently undermined by serpentine musical gestures that suggest his words are no longer entirely his own, but influenced by the alien intelligence he has merged with. The dynamic structure of Rykard's theme follows the psychological arc of his character in ways that emphasize the tragedy of his transformation. The composition begins with quiet scholarly dignity, builds through passages of increasing moral complexity as his methods become more extreme, reaches climactic moments that feel more terrifying than triumphant as his true nature is revealed, and concludes with a passage that suggests not defeat, but a kind of terrible satisfaction, as if Rykard has achieved exactly what he always wanted, regardless of the cost to his humanity. The harmonic resolution of Rykard's theme is particularly sophisticated in its refusal to provide the kind of clear moral conclusion that we might expect from a boss battle composition. Instead of ending with triumphant major chords that suggest the victory of good over evil, the piece concludes with ambiguous harmonies that leave us uncertain about the ultimate meaning of what we have witnessed. This harmonic ambiguity reflects the moral complexity of Rykard's character. While his actions are clearly monstrous, his original motivations were arguably noble, and his critique of the Golden Order's hypocrisies was largely accurate. The overall effect of Rykard's musical theme is to create one of the most intellectually and emotionally challenging encounters in the entire game. The music forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between noble ends and evil means, the seductive power of extremist ideologies, and the ease with which good intentions can be corrupted into serving the very forces they originally opposed. We are invited to see Rykard not as a simple villain, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing justice without maintaining moral boundaries. Mohg, Lord of Blood, Obsession's Dark Symphony, the musical theme for Mohg, Lord of Blood, stands as perhaps the most psychologically disturbing composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. A piece that transforms what could have been straightforward villain music into a complex psychological portrait of obsession, rejection, and the corruption of love itself. From its opening notes, Mohg's theme establishes itself as a study in the musical representation of unhealthy desire, using sophisticated compositional techniques to create an auditory landscape that is simultaneously seductive and deeply unsettling. The composition opens with what can only be described as a corrupted love song, melodic phrases that follow the gentle flowing patterns traditionally associated with romantic music, but which are harmonized in ways that create persistent feelings of unease and wrongness. These opening melodic statements are played primarily by string instruments, using techniques that create an almost vocal quality, as if the music itself is whispering sweet words that contain hidden threats. The immediate effect is to establish Mohg's self-perception as a romantic figure, while simultaneously revealing the fundamentally disturbed nature of his emotions. The main thematic material of Mohg's composition is built around what musicologists call an obsessive motif, a short musical phrase that appears repeatedly throughout the piece, with variations that suggest increasing intensity and desperation. This motif begins as a simple, almost innocent melodic gesture, but becomes increasingly elaborate and distorted with each repetition, creating a musical representation of how obsession transforms simple emotions into something monstrous and all-consuming. The obsessive repetition of this musical material mirrors Mohg's psychological fixation on Miquella and his inability to conceive of any existence beyond the fulfillment of his desires. The orchestration of Mohg's theme reveals the composer's sophisticated understanding of his character through instrumental choices that emphasize both luxury and corruption. The prominent use of brass instruments, particularly French horns and trumpets, creates a sound that evokes both royal ceremony and martial conquest, reflecting Mohg's genuine status as a prince of the royal bloodline and his self-image as a conqueror, claiming his prize. However, these noble brass voices are frequently muted or played with techniques that make them sound muffled and distorted, suggesting that his aristocratic pretensions are fundamentally false, and his understanding of love and courtship has been twisted beyond recognition. String sections in Mohg's theme employ a variety of extended techniques that create sounds suggesting both sensuality and violence. Tremolo passages create a sense of barely controlled excitement, while harsh, percussive attacks on the strings suggest the violence that underlies Mohg's romantic fantasies. Perhaps most disturbingly, the strings frequently play glissando passages, sliding from one note to another, that create sounds reminiscent of both caresses and the flow of blood, establishing a musical connection between Mohg's erotic obsessions and his blood magic practices. The harmonic language of Mohg's theme makes sophisticated use of what classical composers call chromatic harmony, chord progressions that move through notes outside the traditional scale structures, creating feelings of instability and moral ambiguity. These chromatic harmonies give the music a constantly shifting, unstable quality that reflects Mohg's psychological state, while also creating the kind of lush, seductive sound palette associated with romantic music from the late Romantic period. The result is music that sounds beautiful and appealing on the surface, but contains within it a persistent sense of wrongness that becomes more apparent with continued listening. Perhaps most tellingly, Mohg's theme includes several musical techniques traditionally associated with lullabies and children's music: simple melodic patterns, gentle rhythms, and harmonic progressions that evoke safety and comfort. However, these innocent musical elements are consistently corrupted by the addition of dissonant harmonies, unexpected rhythmic disruptions, and instrumental timbres that suggest menace rather than comfort. This musical technique creates an auditory representation of Mohg's fundamental misunderstanding of love and care, his belief that he can force affection through magical compulsion while remaining blind to the violence inherent in his approach. The rhythm section in Mohg's theme creates one of the most unsettling soundscapes in gaming music. Through its combination of ceremonial dignity and predatory urgency, the basic pulse of the composition alternates between stately, courtly rhythms that suggest formal ceremonies and more urgent, driving patterns that evoke pursuit and conquest. This rhythmic duality creates a musical representation of Mohg's self-perception as both a noble suitor conducting proper courtship and a predator stalking his prey, while his inability to recognize the contradiction between these two roles reveals the depth of his psychological disturbance. Percussion in Mohg's theme is used with exceptional sophistication to create multiple layers of symbolic meaning. Traditional orchestral drums provide a foundation of royal ceremony, but they frequently play patterns that are slightly too fast or too intense for genuine dignity, suggesting the manic energy that drives Mohg's obsessions. More exotic percussion instruments create sounds that evoke both the ritual aspects of blood magic and the intimate, private nature of the ceremonies Mohg conducts around the unconscious Miquella. One of the most disturbing aspects of Mohg's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of consent and agency. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent Miquella's presence or perspective, usually appearing as delicate, ethereal melodies played by high strings or woodwind instruments. However, these Miquella passages are consistently overwhelmed and consumed by the more aggressive musical material associated with Mohg, creating an auditory representation of the way Mohg's desires completely override any consideration of his victim's autonomy or well-being. The second phase of the Mohg encounter, where he demonstrates the full extent of his blood magic powers and his devotion to the formless mother, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely terrifying synthesis of religious ecstasy and erotic obsession. The composition maintains the romantic musical language that characterized the earlier passages, but subjects it to increasingly extreme dynamics and orchestration that create feelings of overwhelming intensity and loss of control. The music during these passages suggests not evil, but a kind of terrible sincerity. Mohg genuinely believes that his actions are expressions of love and devotion, making his corruption all the more disturbing. Perhaps most remarkably, Mohg's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference wedding music, ceremonial love songs, or the kind of formal compositions that might accompany royal courtships. These quotations appear as brief fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where we understand how Mohg has reinterpreted his criminal actions as romantic gestures. However, these moments of self-deluding romance are always corrupted by the return of more aggressive musical material that reveals the true nature of his behavior. The vocal elements in Mohg's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both prayer and seduction. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both religious incantation and intimate whispers, creating a musical representation of how Mohg conflated spiritual devotion with erotic desire. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like multiple voices, speaking or singing in unison, suggesting the collective nature of the cult Mohg have built around his obsessions. The dynamic structure of Mohg's theme follows the psychological arc of obsession in ways that maximize its disturbing impact. The composition begins with deceptive gentleness that masks underlying aggression, builds through passages of increasing intensity that mirror the escalation of unwanted attention, reaches climactic moments that feel more violating than triumphant, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not satisfaction, but the temporary satiation of an appetite that can never be truly fulfilled. The harmonic resolution of Mohg's theme is particularly sophisticated in its refusal to provide the kind of clear moral conclusion that might allow listeners to dismiss his character as simply evil. Instead of ending with harmonies that suggest the triumph of good over evil, the piece concludes with ambiguous chord progressions that leave us uncertain about the ultimate meaning of what we have witnessed. This harmonic ambiguity forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of love, desire, and the thin line between devotion and obsession. The overall effect of Mohg's musical theme is to create one of the most psychologically challenging encounters in gaming history. The music forces us to recognize the genuine emotions that drive Mohg's actions, while simultaneously condemning the methods he employs to express those emotions. We are invited to understand that his love for Miquella, while real, has been so corrupted by his own trauma and rejection that it has become indistinguishable from violence. The composition serves as a musical meditation on the nature of unhealthy relationships and the ease with which love can be transformed into its opposite when filtered through unresolved psychological wounds. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, the warrior's lament, the musical theme for Malenia, Blade of Miquella, represents perhaps the most emotionally complex composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack, a piece that must somehow capture both the grace of one of history's greatest warriors and the tragedy of a being whose very existence is defined by an internal struggle against cosmic corruption. From its opening notes, Malenia's theme establishes itself as a study in musical contradictions, simultaneously beautiful and terrible, noble and cursed, triumphant and tragic. The composition opens with what can only be described as a dance of death, melodic phrases that follow the elegant, flowing patterns of classical ballet music, but which are underpinned by harmonic progressions that create persistent feelings of sadness and loss. These opening passages are played primarily by string instruments using techniques that emphasize both grace and fragility, creating a sound that evokes the precision and beauty of expert swordsmanship, while simultaneously suggesting the delicate balance between control and chaos that defines Malenia's existence. The immediate effect is to establish her as a figure of terrible beauty, someone whose greatest gifts have been turned into sources of suffering for herself and others. The main thematic material of Malenia's composition is built around what musicologists call a heroic lament, a musical structure that combines the melodic patterns traditionally associated with victory and triumph, with harmonic progressions that create feelings of profound sadness and loss. This musical technique creates an immediate emotional complexity that reflects Malenia's situation as a being who has achieved legendary status as a warrior, while simultaneously being consumed from within by forces beyond her control. The heroic elements of the melody remind us of her incredible skill and dedication, while the underlying sadness speaks to the cost of her achievements. The orchestration of Malenia's theme reveals the composer's deep understanding of her character through instrumental choices that emphasize both martial prowess and physical vulnerability. The prominent use of brass instruments, particularly trumpets and French horns, creates a sound that evokes both military ceremony and the kind of tragic nobility associated with fallen heroes. However, these noble brass voices are frequently paired with delicate woodwind instruments that create sounds suggesting both the beauty of cherry blossoms and the fragility of someone fighting a losing battle against an internal enemy. String sections in Malenia's theme employ a remarkable variety of techniques that create a soundscape suggesting both the precision of expert swordsmanship and the organic spread of disease and corruption. Rapid passages played with perfect coordination evoke the deadly grace of her combat style, while slower, more sustained passages create sounds that seem to bloom and decay like flowers affected by rot. Perhaps most poignantly, the strings frequently play in harmonies that create beating patterns, slight rhythmic discrepancies that create a sense of instability and internal conflict, reflecting Malenia's constant struggle to maintain control over the scarlet rot within her body. The harmonic language of Malenia's theme makes sophisticated use of what classical composers call modal interchange, the borrowing of chords and progressions from different musical modes to create complex emotional effects. Traditional heroic harmonies associated with military marches and victory songs are frequently mixed with more exotic modal harmonies that evoke both Eastern musical traditions and the otherworldly nature of the cosmic forces that have shaped her fate. This harmonic technique creates music that sounds both familiar and strange, much like Malenia herself occupies a position between the human and divine worlds. Perhaps most tellingly, Malenia's theme includes several musical elements traditionally associated with flower imagery and natural cycles. Gentle melodic phrases that suggest growth and blooming, harmonic progressions that evoke the changing of seasons, and rhythmic patterns that mirror the natural processes of life and death. However, these nature-based musical elements are consistently corrupted by the addition of dissonant harmonies and unstable rhythmic patterns that suggest the perversion of natural processes by the scarlet rot. This musical technique creates an auditory representation of how Malenia's curse has turned her connection to natural forces into a source of destruction rather than creation. The rhythm section in Malenia's theme creates one of the most sophisticated musical representations of internal conflict in gaming history. The basic pulse of the composition maintains the steady, disciplined patterns associated with military precision and martial arts training, reflecting Malenia's incredible self-control and dedication to her craft. However, this steady rhythmic foundation is constantly interrupted by syncopated passages, unexpected accents, and rhythmic irregularities that suggest the way her internal struggle against the rot occasionally breaks through her carefully maintained composure. Percussion in Malenia's theme is used with exceptional subtlety to create multiple layers of symbolic meaning. Traditional military drums provide a foundation that evokes her identity as a warrior and general, but they frequently play patterns that incorporate elements of dance rhythms, reflecting the balletic grace that characterizes her combat style. More delicate percussion instruments, bells, chimes, and metallic instruments create sounds that evoke both the beauty of her prosthetic limbs, crafted from unalloyed gold, and the tragic necessity of replacing parts of her body that had been consumed by corruption. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Malenia's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of sacrifice and devotion. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent her love for Miquella and her dedication to protecting him, usually appearing as warm, gentle melodies that provide brief moments of emotional refuge from the more tragic elements of the composition. However, these loving musical gestures are consistently followed by passages that suggest the cost of her devotion, the way her willingness to fight for her brother has forced her to embrace the very corruption she has spent her life resisting. The second phase of the Malenia encounter, where she blooms into the goddess of Rot and demonstrates the full destructive potential of her curse, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely terrifying synthesis of divine transcendence and cosmic horror. The composition maintains the noble, heroic musical language that characterized the earlier passages but subjects it to a process of transformation that mirrors Malenia's own metamorphosis. Melodies that began with graceful beauty become twisted and overgrown, like flowers blooming beyond their natural limits, while harmonic progressions that suggested triumph become corrupted into expressions of inevitable doom. Perhaps most remarkably, Malenia's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference lullabies, children's songs, or the kind of gentle music that might be used to comfort someone who is sick or dying. These quotations appear as brief fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where we understand the depth of her love for Miquella and her desire to create a world where he could exist safely. However, these moments of tenderness are always overwhelmed by the return of more aggressive musical material that reveals how her love has been weaponized by circumstances beyond her control. The vocal elements in Malenia's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both prayer and war cry. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both the disciplined breathing of martial arts practice and the labored breathing of someone struggling against disease, creating a musical representation of how every aspect of her existence is shaped by the tension between strength and vulnerability. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like wind through flowers or the rustling of leaves, connecting her to natural imagery while simultaneously suggesting the way natural beauty can become threatening when infected by corruption. The dynamic structure of Malenia's theme follows the emotional arc of her character in ways that emphasize both her nobility and her tragedy. The composition begins with quiet dignity that masks underlying pain, builds through passages of increasing intensity that demonstrate her incredible skill and power, reaches climactic moments that feel both triumphant and heartbreaking as the full scope of her sacrifice becomes apparent, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not victory or defeat, but a kind of terrible transcendence beyond human categories of success and failure. The harmonic resolution of Malenia's theme is particularly sophisticated in its use of what musicians call an interrupted cadence, a harmonic progression that seems to be moving toward a stable, conclusive resolution, but instead moves to an unexpected chord that leaves the music feeling unresolved and open-ended. This harmonic technique reflects the fundamental ambiguity of Malenia's fate. While she achieves a form of godhood through her transformation, this achievement comes at the cost of everything that made her human, leaving us uncertain whether her transcendence represents triumph or ultimate defeat. The overall effect of Malenia's musical theme is to create one of the most emotionally devastating encounters in gaming history. The music constantly asks us to recognize the nobility of her purposes, while mourning the terrible cost of achieving them. We are invited to see her not as a monster to be defeated, but as a tragic figure whose greatest virtues, her love for her brother, her dedication to protecting others, her willingness to sacrifice everything for a just cause, have been turned into instruments of destruction by forces completely beyond her control. The composition serves as a musical meditation on the nature of heroism and the price that the truly noble must sometimes pay for their ideals. Morgott, the Omen King. The Guardian's Melancholy, the musical theme for Morgott, the Omen King, stands as perhaps the most psychologically penetrating composition in the Elden Ring soundtrack, a piece that transforms what should be a straightforward battle with a defending monarch into a profound meditation on loyalty, self-worth, and the tragic consequences of internalized oppression. From its opening measures, Morgott's theme establishes itself as a study in musical irony, using the traditional language of royal and military music to tell the story of a being whose greatest strength, his unwavering devotion to duty, has become the instrument of his own psychological destruction. The composition opens with what can only be described as a broken fanfare, brass instruments attempting to sound the traditional calls associated with royal ceremony and the defense of capital cities, but playing in harmonies that create subtle feelings of incompleteness and sadness. These opening brass statements follow the correct rhythmic patterns and melodic contours of ceremonial music, but they are harmonized in ways that suggest something fundamentally missing or distorted in what should be a triumphant proclamation. The immediate effect is to establish Morgott's genuine authority and noble intentions, while simultaneously revealing the psychological wounds that undermine his ability to find satisfaction in his achievements. The main thematic material of Morgott's composition is built around what musicologists call a duty motif, a musical phrase that combines the steady, reliable patterns associated with military service and institutional loyalty with harmonic progressions that create feelings of resignation and quiet despair. This motif appears throughout the composition in various forms, sometimes played with confidence and determination, other times appearing hesitant and uncertain, creating a musical representation of how Morgott's sense of duty provides him with both purpose and torment. The orchestration of Morgott's theme reveals the composer's sophisticated understanding of his character through instrumental choices that emphasize both royal dignity and fundamental alienation. The prominent use of French horns throughout the piece creates a sound that evokes both military tradition and the kind of noble melancholy associated with figures who serve causes greater than themselves. However, these horns frequently play in muted tones that make them sound distant and isolated, reflecting Morgott's position as someone who serves the Golden Order while remaining forever outside its true acceptance. String sections in Morgott's theme employ techniques that create a soundscape suggesting both disciplined military precision and the weight of carrying impossible burdens. Measured, rhythmic passages evoke the steady march of duty and responsibility, while more sustained melodic lines create sounds that seem to stretch under enormous pressure, much like Morgott himself strains under the weight of defending an institution that considers him an abomination. The strings frequently play in unison, suggesting the single-minded focus of his devotion, but this unison playing has a hollow, mechanical quality that suggests duty performed without joy or hope of reward. The harmonic language of Morgott's theme makes profound use of what classical composers call modal harmony, chord progressions based on ancient musical scales that create feelings of timelessness and spiritual depth. These modal harmonies give the music a sense of connection to traditions and values that transcend individual concerns, reflecting Morgott's genuine belief in the principles underlying the Golden Order. However, these noble harmonic progressions are frequently interrupted by more modern dissonant chords that create feelings of alienation and rejection, suggesting the way his personal experience of exclusion conflicts with his intellectual commitment to the system that excludes him. Perhaps most tellingly, Morgott's theme includes several musical elements that seem to reference religious hymns, ceremonial chants, or the kind of music that might be played during coronations or other state ceremonies. These references appear as brief melodic fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where we understand the depth of Morgott's knowledge and appreciation of the traditions he serves. However, these moments of ceremonial grandeur are always brief and quickly overwhelmed by more somber musical material, suggesting that while Morgott understands the beauty and meaning of these traditions, he can never truly participate in them as an equal. The rhythm section in Morgott's theme creates one of the most emotionally complex musical representations of psychological conflict in gaming history. The basic pulse of the composition maintains the steady, disciplined patterns associated with military service and royal ceremony, reflecting Morgott's incredible self-control and dedication to proper form. However, this steady rhythmic foundation is occasionally interrupted by irregular patterns and unexpected pauses that suggest moments when the weight of his internal contradictions becomes too much to bear. Percussion in Morgott's theme is used with exceptional restraint and precision to create multiple layers of symbolic meaning. Traditional military drums provide a foundation that evokes his role as defender of the capital, but they frequently play patterns that incorporate elements of both ceremonial grandeur and funereal solemnity, reflecting the way his greatest triumphs feel more like acts of mourning than celebration. More exotic percussion instruments create sounds that evoke both the supernatural aspects of his Omen nature and the lonely echo of footsteps in empty halls, suggesting the isolation that defines his existence despite his position of authority. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Morgott's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of self-perception and identity. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent Morgott's view of himself, usually appearing as noble, dignified melodies that suggest genuine authority and moral purpose. However, these self-affirming musical gestures are consistently undermined by darker, more dissonant passages that suggest his internalized belief in his own unworthiness, creating a musical representation of the constant internal struggle between his achievements and his self-doubt. The second phase of the Morgott encounter, where he reveals the full extent of his magical abilities and his determination to defend the Erdtree at any cost, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely tragic synthesis of personal nobility and institutional blindness. The composition maintains the dignified, ceremonially musical language that characterized the earlier passages, but subjects it to increasing intensity and complexity that mirrors Morgott's growing desperation to prove his worth through ever more extreme demonstrations of loyalty. Perhaps most remarkably, Morgott's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference the kind of celebratory music that might be played for victorious, returning heroes or newly crowned monarchs. These quotations appear as brief fragments that suggest what Morgott's life might have been like if he had been born without his curse, if his achievements had been recognized and celebrated rather than merely tolerated. However, these moments of imagined triumph are always fleeting and quickly consumed by the return of more melancholy musical material that reminds us of the reality of his situation. The vocal elements in Morgott's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both royal proclamation and private lamentation. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both the confident voice of authority, addressing subjects, and the quiet voice of someone talking to themselves in empty rooms, creating a musical representation of how Morgott's public persona masks his private struggles. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like echoes, suggesting that even his most authoritative pronouncements are somehow hollow or incomplete. The dynamic structure of Morgott's theme follows the psychological arc of his character in ways that emphasize the tragedy of his situation. The composition begins with forced confidence that masks underlying uncertainty, builds through passages of increasing intensity that demonstrate his genuine skill and determination, reaches climactic moments that feel more exhausting than triumphant as the full cost of his devotion becomes apparent, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not victory or defeat, but a kind of weary acceptance of a burden that can never be set down. The harmonic resolution of Morgott's theme is particularly sophisticated in its use of what musicians call a plagal cadence, a harmonic progression traditionally associated with religious music and often called the Amen cadence because of its use in church services. This harmonic choice suggests that Morgott's death represents not defeat, but a form of spiritual resolution, a final moment of peace for someone who has spent his entire existence struggling to reconcile his faith with his experience of rejection. The overall effect of Morgott's musical theme is to create one of the most psychologically complex encounters in gaming history. The music constantly asks us to recognize the nobility of his character, while mourning the waste of that nobility in service to an unworthy cause. We are invited to see him not as an enemy to be overcome, but as a tragic figure whose greatest virtues have been turned against himself by a system that taught him to hate what he was rather than value what he could become. The composition serves as a musical meditation on the nature of loyalty, duty, and the price of seeking validation from institutions that are fundamentally incapable of providing it. The Fire Giant, monument to forgotten peoples. The musical theme for the Fire Giant represents one of the most historically and culturally resonant compositions in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack, a piece that transforms what could have been a straightforward battle against a massive enemy into a profound meditation on cultural genocide, survivors' guilt, and the terrible burden of being the last representative of a destroyed civilization. From its opening notes, the Fire Giant's theme establishes itself as both a requiem for the lost fire monks and a lament for the destruction of an entire way of life. The composition opens with what can only be described as the sound of emptiness, sparse, echoing musical textures that suggest vast, desolate spaces where once there was community and warmth. These opening passages are built around what musicologists call quartal harmony, chords constructed from fourth intervals, rather than the more familiar thirds, creating a hollow, open sound that evokes both the vastness of the mountaintops of the giants and the emotional void left by the extinction of an entire people. The main thematic material of the Fire Giant's composition is built around what can only be called a cultural memory motif, a musical phrase that seems to carry within it the echoes of folk songs, religious hymns, and ceremonial music from a lost civilization. This motif appears throughout the composition in fragmentary form, never quite complete enough to constitute a full melody, creating the musical impression of someone trying to remember songs from childhood that have been partially erased by trauma and time. The effect is profoundly moving, suggesting that the Fire Giant carries within himself not just his own memories, but the cultural heritage of his entire people. The orchestration of the Fire Giant's theme reveals the composer's deep understanding of his role as both individual and cultural repository through instrumental choices that emphasize both massive scale and profound loneliness. The prominent use of low brass instruments, tubas, bass trombones, and contrabass instruments creates a sound that evokes both the physical enormity of the giant himself and the weight of carrying an entire civilization's memory. However, these massive instrumental voices frequently play alone or in sparse textures, creating a sense of isolation that reflects the giant's position as the sole survivor of his people. String sections in the Fire Giant's theme employ techniques that create a soundscape, suggesting both the warmth of communal fires and the cold emptiness of extinguished flames. Sustained passages played with intense vibrato create sounds that seem to flicker and dance like firelight, while abrupt stops and silences suggest flames suddenly extinguished, creating a musical representation of the way the giant's people were systematically destroyed. The strings frequently play in extreme registers, either very high or very low, creating sounds that seem to reach beyond normal human ranges, suggesting both the supernatural nature of the giants and their fundamental alienation from the current world order. The mnemonic language of the Fire Giant's theme makes profound use of what classical composers call modal scales, ancient musical systems that predate the major and minor keys that dominate most modern music. These modal harmonies create a sense of timelessness and cultural otherness that reflects the giant's status as representatives of an older, more primitive order that existed before the Golden Order's dominance. However, these ancient modal harmonies are frequently interrupted by more modern, chromatic passages that create feelings of disruption and violence, suggesting the way the giant's traditional way of life was shattered by outside forces. Perhaps most poignantly, the Fire Giant's theme includes several musical elements that seem to reference what might be called extinction music, sparse, fragmentary passages that suggest the final moments of cultural traditions, the last performances of ancestral songs, or the dying embers of sacred fires. These passages are characterized by their incompleteness and fragility, as if the music itself is struggling to survive against forces that seek to erase it entirely. The effect is to create a musical representation of cultural death that is both specific to the giant's situation and universally recognizable as a representation of loss and ending. The rhythm section in the Fire Giant's theme creates one of the most emotionally powerful musical representations of historical trauma in gaming history. The basic pulse of the composition is built around irregular, limping patterns that suggest someone struggling to move forward despite carrying an enormous burden. These rhythmic patterns frequently incorporate elements that evoke both the heavy footsteps of a massive being and the irregular heartbeat of someone under extreme stress, creating a musical representation of how the giant's physical and emotional burdens are inseparably connected. Percussion in the Fire Giant's theme is used with exceptional sophistication to create multiple layers of cultural and historical meaning. Traditional orchestral drums provide a foundation that evokes both the ceremonial music of ancient peoples and the sound of distant battles, reflecting the giant's role as both cultural preservationist and unwilling participant in cosmic conflicts. More exotic percussion instruments create sounds that suggest both the crackling of great fires and the breaking of ancient stones, connecting the giant to elemental forces, while simultaneously suggesting the destruction of his civilization's monuments and sacred sites. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the fire giant's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of duty and obligation to the dead. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent the voices of the giant's ancestors or the expectations of his destroyed people, usually appearing as distant, echoing melodies that seem to call to him from beyond death. However, these ancestral voices are consistently overwhelmed by more immediate musical material that represents the harsh realities of his current situation, creating a musical representation of the conflict between honoring the past and surviving in the present. The second phase of the fire giant encounter, where he tears off his own leg and embraces his role as keeper of the flame of ruin, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely apocalyptic synthesis of personal sacrifice and cosmic destruction. The composition maintains the culturally specific musical language that characterized the earlier passages, but subjects it to increasingly extreme dynamics and orchestration that create feelings of world-ending power and terminal finality. The music during these passages suggests not evil, but a kind of terrible duty. The giant has become the instrument of forces that will destroy the world, but he does so not out of malice, but because he has been left with no other choice. Perhaps most remarkably, the fire giant's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference what might be funeral music, memorial songs, or the kind of music that might be played at the sites of great tragedies. These quotations appear as brief fragments that suggest the giant's role as a living memorial to his people, someone whose very existence serves as a reminder of what has been lost. However, these memorial passages are always colored by the more immediate musical material that represents his current situation, creating a musical representation of how grief and trauma can transform memorial into weapon. The vocal elements in the fire giant's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both lamentation and war cry. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both the voices of a destroyed people crying out for justice and the roar of flames consuming everything in their path, creating a musical representation of how the giant's grief has been transformed into an instrument of apocalyptic destruction. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like wind through ruins, or the echoing of voices in empty spaces, suggesting that the giant carries within himself the ghosts of his entire civilization. The dynamic structure of the fire giant's theme follows an emotional arc that emphasizes both the personal and historical scope of his tragedy. The composition begins with quiet mourning that masks enormous grief, builds through passages of increasing intensity that demonstrate the weight of cultural memory, reaches climactic moments that feel both destructive and liberating as the full scope of his power is revealed, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not victory or defeat, but the completion of a historical process that has been building for millennia. The harmonic resolution of the fire giant's theme is particularly sophisticated in its use of what musicians call an unresolved ending. The music concludes without providing the kind of harmonic closure that would suggest the conflict has been definitively resolved. This musical technique reflects the fact that the giant's defeat does not undo the historical injustices that created his situation, and that his death represents not the solution to a problem, but simply the end of one chapter in a larger story of cultural destruction and cosmic change. Godfrey, first Elden Lord, the weight of former glory. The musical theme for Godfrey, first Elden Lord, represents perhaps the most emotionally complex composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack, when considered in context of his relationship to the overall narrative. This is music that must somehow capture both the genuine nobility and heroic stature that made Godfrey worthy of his titles, and the profound tragedy of a being whose greatest qualities have been rendered obsolete by changing cosmic circumstances. From its opening measures, Godfrey's theme establishes itself as a meditation on the nature of heroism, the passage of time, and the painful process of being discarded by the very institutions one helped to create. The composition opens with what can only be described as a faded fanfare, brass instruments, playing the traditional calls associated with royal ceremony and military triumph, but with a tonal quality that suggests these sounds are reaching us from across a great distance of time. These opening brass statements follow all the correct formal patterns of ceremonial music, but they are orchestrated in ways that create subtle feelings of nostalgia and loss, as if we are hearing the echoes of greatness, rather than greatness itself. The immediate effect is to establish Godfrey's legitimate claim to heroic status, while simultaneously acknowledging that the world that created and celebrated that heroism has fundamentally changed. The main thematic material of Godfrey's composition is built around what musicologists might call a heroic remembrance motif, a musical phrase that combines the bold, confident melodic patterns associated with classical heroic themes, with harmonic progressions that create feelings of retrospection and melancholy. This motif appears throughout the composition in various forms, sometimes played with full orchestral power that recalls his former glory, other times appearing hesitant and uncertain, as if struggling to remember what it once meant to be a hero, in a world that has moved beyond the need for heroes. The orchestration of Godfrey's theme reveals the composer's sophisticated understanding of his character through instrumental choices that emphasize both legitimate authority and temporal displacement. The prominent use of traditional orchestral instruments, strings, brass, and woodwinds in classical configurations creates a sound that evokes the musical traditions associated with epic poetry, classical drama, and the kind of formal compositions that might celebrate great military victories. However, these traditional instrumental voices are frequently placed in uncomfortable registers or asked to play in ways that emphasize their limitations rather than their strengths, creating a musical representation of how Godfrey's classical heroic virtues are poorly suited to the corrupted world he now inhabits. String sections in Godfrey's theme employ techniques that create a soundscape suggesting both the grandeur of epic literature and the weight of carrying impossible expectations. Broad, sweeping melodic lines evoke the kind of noble themes that might accompany tales of legendary heroes, while more sustained, heavily bowed passages create sounds that seem to struggle under enormous pressure, much like Godfrey himself strains under the weight of living up to a reputation that was built in a very different world. The strings frequently play in perfect unison, suggesting the kind of moral clarity and unified purpose that characterized his original reign. But this unison playing often sounds forced or artificial when applied to his current circumstances. The harmonic language of Godfrey's theme makes profound use of what classical composers call tonal nostalgia, harmonic progressions that deliberately evoke the musical language of earlier historical periods to create feelings of longing for a lost golden age. These harmonies are based on the kind of clear, stable chord progressions that dominated music during periods when concepts like honor, duty, and heroic virtue were less complicated than they have become in the modern world. However, these nostalgic harmonic progressions are frequently interrupted by more modern, ambiguous chords that create feelings of uncertainty and moral complexity, suggesting the way Godfrey's clear moral worldview has been complicated by exposure to the moral ambiguities of the current age. Perhaps most tellingly, Godfrey's theme includes several musical elements that seem to reference what might be called institution music, the kind of formal ceremonial compositions that are played at state functions, military ceremonies, or other occasions, when societies celebrate their foundational values and historical achievements. These institutional musical references appear as brief fragments woven throughout the composition, creating moments where we understand how deeply Godfrey was integrated into the symbolic and ceremonial life of the Golden Order. However, these moments of institutional grandeur are always brief and quickly overwhelmed by more personal, individual musical material that suggests his current status as someone who exists outside the institutions he helped to create. The rhythm section in Godfrey's theme creates one of the most sophisticated musical representations of temporal displacement in gaming history. The basic pulse of the composition maintains the steady, march-like patterns associated with military tradition and institutional stability, reflecting Godfrey's continued commitment to the values and practices that shaped his identity. However, this steady rhythmic foundation is occasionally interrupted by more irregular patterns and unexpected tempo changes that suggest someone struggling to adapt to a world that operates according to different rules than the one he was designed to navigate. Percussion in Godfrey's theme is used with exceptional subtlety to create multiple layers of historical and personal meaning. Traditional military drums provide a foundation that evokes his identity as a warrior and general, but they frequently play patterns that incorporate elements of both ceremonial grandeur and funeral marches, reflecting the way his return represents both a restoration of past glory and the final ending of an historical era. More exotic percussion instruments create sounds that evoke both the supernatural forces he must now contend with and the distant thunder of battles fought in ages past. One of the most moving aspects of Godfrey's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of adaptation and change. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent his attempts to understand and respond to the new world he finds himself in, usually appearing as tentative melodic explorations that venture away from the familiar harmonic territories of his traditional musical language. However, these experimental passages consistently return to more familiar musical material, creating a musical representation of someone whose fundamental nature makes it difficult for him to fully adapt to changed circumstances. The second phase of the Godfrey encounter, where he sheds his civilized persona and embraces his original identity as Hora Luce, warrior, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely cathartic synthesis of primal energy and refined technique. The composition abandons much of the formal ceremonial musical language that characterized the earlier passages in favor of more rhythmically driven, physically immediate music that suggests the liberation of returning to one's authentic self. However, even this more primal musical material is sophisticated in its construction and orchestration, suggesting that Godfrey's return to his warrior nature is not a regression, but a conscious choice to embrace the aspects of himself that remain vital and effective. Perhaps most remarkably, Godfrey's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference the kind of music that might be played at retirement ceremonies, memorial services, or other occasions when societies formally acknowledge the end of someone's active service. These quotations appear as brief fragments that suggest the ceremonial aspects of his current situation. He has returned not to resume his former role, but to provide a kind of final test or graduation exercise for the new generation of heroes. However, these ceremonial passages are always integrated with more active, combat-oriented musical material, creating a musical representation of how even his apparent retirement is actually a form of continued service. The vocal elements in Godfrey's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both royal proclamation and personal reflection. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both the confident voice of someone accustomed to command and the more private voice of someone reflecting on a long and complicated life, creating a musical representation of how Godfrey's public persona masks deeper questions about the meaning and value of his achievements. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like conversations between different aspects of the same personality, suggesting the internal dialogue between his civilized and primitive selves. The dynamic structure of Godfrey's theme follows an emotional arc that emphasizes both the grandeur of his achievements and the complexity of his current situation. The composition begins with ceremonial dignity that gradually reveals underlying tension, builds through passages of increasing intensity that demonstrate his continued strength and skill, reaches climactic moments that feel both triumphant and nostalgic as the full scope of his legacy becomes apparent, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not victory or defeat, but the completion of a historical cycle that has been running for centuries. The harmonic resolution of Godfrey's theme is particularly sophisticated in its use of what musicians call a modal cadence, a harmonic conclusion that employs the musical language of ancient or folk traditions rather than the more familiar patterns of modern harmony. This harmonic choice suggests that Godfrey represents a connection to older, more fundamental forms of human valor that transcend the specific institutions and ideologies that have risen and fallen during his lifetime. Radagon, of the Golden Order. The paradox of divine unity. The musical theme for Radagon, of the Golden Order, represents perhaps the most philosophically complex composition in the entire Elden Ring soundtrack. A piece that must somehow capture the fundamental paradox of a being who is simultaneously two different people, with conflicting natures, goals, and relationships to the cosmic forces that shape the lands between. From its opening notes, Radagon's theme establishes itself as a study in musical duality, using sophisticated compositional techniques to create an auditory representation of the impossible psychological and metaphysical tensions that define his existence. The composition opens with what can only be described as conflicted authority, musical gestures that attempt to project the kind of confident power associated with divine rule, but which are immediately undermined by counter-melodies and harmonic progressions that suggest internal division, fundamental instability. These opening passages are characterized by their use of what musicologists call false resolution, moments where the music seems to be moving toward harmonic stability and conclusive authority, but instead moves to unexpected chords that leave listeners feeling unsettled and uncertain about what they have just heard. The main thematic material of Radagon's composition is built around what might be called a unity division motif, a musical phrase that begins as a single melodic line, but quickly splits into two separate voices that move in different directions, sometimes harmonizing with each other, and sometimes conflicting in ways that create dissonance and tension. This musical technique creates an immediate auditory representation of Radagon's fundamental nature as a being who is both one and two, individual and divided, unified and conflicted in ways that defy normal understanding of identity and consciousness. The orchestration of Radagon's theme reveals the composer's deep understanding of his metaphysical situation through instrumental choices that emphasize both divine authority and internal fragmentation. The prominent use of brass instruments, particularly trumpets and French horns, creates a sound that evokes both religious ceremony and royal proclamation, reflecting Radagon's genuine status as a vessel for cosmic forces and his role as the official consort of Queen Marika. However, these noble brass voices are frequently divided between different instrumental sections that play complementary but separate musical lines, creating a sound that suggests authority split against itself. String sections in Radagon's theme employ a remarkable technique called division, where a single section of instruments is divided into multiple independent parts that can either harmonize or conflict with each other, depending on the musical demands of the moment. This orchestral technique creates a soundscape that can shift between unity and division, between harmony and discord, in ways that mirror Radagon's psychological state as someone who contains within himself multiple, potentially conflicting identities and purposes. The harmonic language of Radagon's theme makes sophisticated use of what classical composers call polytonality, the simultaneous use of multiple key centers that create complex harmonic relationships impossible to achieve within a single tonal framework. This harmonic technique creates music that sounds both familiar and alien, both authoritative and unstable, reflecting the way Radagon exists as both a recognizable individual with understandable motivations and as something fundamentally beyond normal human categories of understanding. Perhaps most remarkably, Radagon's theme includes several musical elements that seem to quote or reference Queen Marika's musical themes, but these quotations are consistently modified, inverted, or played in different keys that make them sound like variations or responses rather than direct statements. This musical technique creates an auditory representation of the complex relationship between Radagon and Marika. They are the same being, but they are also distinct personalities with different perspectives on their shared cosmic responsibility. The rhythm section in Radagon's theme creates one of the most psychologically complex musical representations of identity crisis in gaming history. The basic lass of the composition frequently shifts between different rhythmic patterns, sometimes maintaining the steady, authoritative beats associated with divine rule and ceremonial order, other times adopting more irregular, uncertain patterns that suggest internal conflict and psychological instability. These rhythmic shifts often occur without warning and sometimes happen simultaneously in different sections of the orchestra, creating a musical representation of a consciousness that cannot maintain consistent identity or purpose. Percussion in Radagon's theme is used with exceptional sophistication to represent both the divine authority he wields and the cosmic forces that wield him. Traditional orchestral tympani provide a foundation that evokes both ceremonial grandeur and the kind of profound resonant power associated with divine manifestation. However, these familiar percussion sounds are frequently joined by more exotic instruments that create ringing, metallic tones, suggesting both religious bells and the sound of cosmic machinery, reflecting Radagon's role as both a conscious agent and an instrument of forces beyond his control. One of the most disturbing aspects of Radagon's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of free will and determinism. Throughout the theme, certain musical passages seem to represent his attempts to assert individual agency and make independent choices, usually appearing as melodic lines that venture away from the established harmonic and rhythmic patterns of the composition. However, these independent musical gestures are consistently overwhelmed by larger orchestral forces that pull them back into predetermined patterns, creating a musical representation of someone whose apparent freedom of choice is actually an illusion created by cosmic forces that have already determined his fate. The second phase of the Radagon encounter, where he demonstrates the full extent of his power as a vessel for the Elden Ring and the greater will, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely cosmic scope and complexity. The composition maintains the divided, conflicted musical language that characterized the earlier passages, but subjects it to increasingly extreme dynamics and orchestration that create feelings of divine transcendence and cosmic authority. However, even these moments of apparent triumph and ultimate power are undercut by the persistent musical divisions and conflicts that suggest Radagon's victories are achieved at enormous personal cost. Perhaps most poignantly, Radagon's theme includes several musical quotations that seem to reference family music, domestic melodies, or the kind of intimate compositions that might be associated with personal relationships and private moments. These quotations appear as brief fragments that suggest the human relationships and personal connections that Radagon has formed throughout his various identities and incarnations. However, these moments of personal warmth are always brief and quickly overwhelmed by more cosmic musical material, creating a musical representation of how his divine responsibilities have made genuine personal relationships impossible to maintain. The vocal elements in Radagon's composition, while wordless, carry the weight of both divine proclamation and personal anguish. The orchestration frequently includes sounds that suggest both the authoritative voice of cosmic law and the confused voice of someone struggling to understand their own nature and purpose, creating a musical representation of how Radagon's consciousness exists in a constant state of tension between his roles as individual agent and cosmic instrument. These pseudo-vocal elements often employ techniques that make them sound like multiple voices, speaking simultaneously, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in conflict, suggesting the multiplicity of identity that defines his existence. The dynamic structure of Radagon's theme follows an emotional arc that emphasizes both the grandeur of his cosmic role and the personal cost of fulfilling that role. The composition begins with apparent authority that gradually reveals underlying instability, builds through passages of increasing complexity that demonstrate the impossibility of his situation, reaches climactic moments that feel both transcendent and tragic as the full scope of his cosmic burden becomes apparent, and concludes with a resolution that suggests not victory or defeat, but the eternal continuation of a cosmic process that has no beginning or end. The harmonic resolution of Radagon's theme is particularly sophisticated in its refusal to provide the kind of conclusive ending that would suggest his conflicts have been resolved. Instead, the composition concludes with what musicians call an open or suspended harmony, chords that contain within them multiple possible resolutions, without committing to any single one. This harmonic technique reflects the fundamental ambiguity of Radagon's nature and fate. He exists in a state of permanent potential resolution that can never be actualized. Elden Beast, the music of cosmic indifference. The musical theme for the Elden Beast represents the culmination of Elden Ring's musical storytelling, a composition that must somehow capture the nature of a cosmic entity that exists beyond human categories of understanding, while still creating an emotionally resonant experience for players who have journeyed through hours of deeply personal, character-driven musical narratives. From its opening measures, the Elden Beast's theme establishes itself as something fundamentally different from every other composition in the game. This is not music about character, personality, or individual tragedy, but rather an attempt to create an auditory representation of cosmic forces that operate according to principles that transcend human comprehension. The composition opens with what can only be described as the sound of infinity, vast, sustained harmonic structures that seem to stretch beyond the normal boundaries of musical time and space. These opening passages are built around what musicologists call just intonation, a tuning system based on pure mathematical ratios, rather than the slightly compromised intervals of normal orchestral instruments. This tuning choice creates harmonies that sound both perfectly natural and eerily alien, reflecting the Elden Beast's nature as something that embodies universal principles while remaining fundamentally alien to human understanding. The main thematic material of the Elden Beast's composition is built around what might be called a cosmic scale, a musical structure that incorporates mathematical relationships and harmonic ratios that exist in nature but are rarely used in traditional music. This scale creates melodies that sound both familiar and impossible, as if they follow natural laws that human music has forgotten or never learned. The effect is to create a musical representation of cosmic order that operates according to principles more fundamental than human culture or individual psychology. The orchestration of the Elden Beast's theme reveals the composer's attempt to transcend the limitations of traditional musical instruments through techniques that push each instrument beyond its normal capabilities. String instruments are asked to play in extreme registers and with extended techniques that create sounds suggesting both the music of the spheres and the fundamental vibrations of matter itself. Brass instruments play with mutes and special techniques that create ethereal, otherworldly tones that seem to come from beyond the normal range of human hearing. Woodwind instruments employ multiphonics and other advanced techniques that allow single instruments to create multiple simultaneous tones, creating sounds that suggest the complexity and multiplicity of cosmic forces. The harmonic language of the Elden Beast theme makes use of what might be called universal harmony, chord progressions based on mathematical relationships that appear throughout nature, from the orbital periods of planets to the resonance frequencies of crystals and living cells. These harmonies create music that sounds both completely natural and completely alien, reflecting the Elden Beast's role as an entity that embodies cosmic principles while remaining fundamentally beyond human comprehension. Perhaps most remarkably, the Elden Beast theme includes no musical elements that could be interpreted as personal, emotional, or psychological in the way that characterizes every other boss theme in the game. There are no motifs suggesting memory, no harmonic progressions evoking specific emotions, no rhythmic patterns that might represent individual consciousness or personal struggle. Instead, the composition maintains a kind of musical objectivity that reflects the Elden Beast's nature as a cosmic force rather than a personal entity. The rhythm section in the Elden Beast's theme creates one of the most unusual musical experiences in gaming history through its use of what might be called cosmic time, rhythmic patterns based on mathematical ratios and natural cycles rather than the human scale pulse that characterizes most music. These rhythmic patterns often incorporate the golden ratio, prime number sequences, and other mathematical relationships that appear throughout nature, creating a sense of musical time that operates according to universal principles rather than human perception. Percussion in the Elden Beast's theme is used to create sounds that suggest both the music of creation and the eventual heat death of the universe. Traditional percussion instruments are joined by found objects, electronic manipulation, and extended techniques that create sounds suggesting the fundamental forces of physics, a vibration of atomic particles, the resonance of electromagnetic fields, the sound of matter, organizing itself according to natural law. The overall effect is to create a percussion palette that sounds like the universe itself, making music. One of the most philosophically challenging aspects of the Elden Beast's musical characterization is the way the composition handles the concept of consciousness and agency. Unlike every other boss theme in the game, which suggests some form of individual consciousness struggling with cosmic forces, the Elden Beast's theme provides no musical evidence of internal conflict, personal motivation, or individual perspective. The music suggests not a being that thinks and feels, but a process that simply exists and operates according to its nature. The second phase of the Elden Beast encounter, where it demonstrates its ability to manipulate reality on a cosmic scale, is accompanied by music that achieves a genuinely transcendent scope that pushes the boundaries of what musical composition can represent. The orchestration expands to include sounds that suggest not just musical instruments, but the fundamental forces of creation itself: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces operating at a scale that makes individual consciousness irrelevant. Perhaps most unsettling, the Elden Beast's theme includes no musical quotations or references to any of the other themes from the game, where other boss themes frequently incorporate fragments of each other's musical material, creating a sense of interconnection and shared cosmic story. The Elden Beast's music exists in complete isolation from the personal narratives that have driven the rest of the soundtrack. This musical isolation reflects its nature as something that exists outside the web of relationships, motivations, and conflicts that define every other character in the game. The vocal elements in the Elden Beast's composition, such as they are, carry no suggestion of individual voice or personal expression. Instead, the orchestration occasionally includes sounds that might be described as cosmic vocalize, wordless sounds that suggest the universe itself singing, but with no indication of consciousness, intention, or emotion behind the singing. These sounds often employ techniques that make them sound like natural phenomena rather than musical performance. The sound of solar wind, the resonance of planetary rings, the background radiation left over from the creation of the universe. The dynamic structure of the Elden Beast theme follows no emotional arc in the traditional sense, instead organizing itself according to mathematical principles and natural cycles that create a sense of inevitable cosmic process rather than dramatic narrative. The composition builds and recedes according to patterns that seem to follow astronomical cycles, crystalline growth patterns, and other natural phenomena rather than the psychological development that characterizes traditional musical storytelling. The harmonic resolution of the Elden Beast's theme is perhaps the most philosophically complex musical conclusion in gaming history. Rather than providing closure in the human sense, the satisfaction of conflicts resolved or journeys completed, the music concludes with a sense of cosmic continuation that suggests the processes it represents will continue long after individual consciousness has ceased to exist. The final harmonies suggest not ending, but transformation, not conclusion, but transition to new phases of cosmic evolution. The symphony of tragedy, how musical themes connect. Having examined the individual musical portraits that accompany each of Elden Ring's major encounters, we must now step back and consider how these compositions work together to create a larger musical narrative about the nature of tragedy, power, and the human condition in a world shaped by cosmic forces beyond individual control. The genius of Elden Ring's soundtrack lies not just in the quality of its individual pieces, but in the sophisticated way these compositions interconnect, reference each other, and build toward a unified understanding of the tragic circumstances that have shaped the lands between. The most immediately apparent connection between the various boss themes lies in their shared use of what might be called a tragic nobility motif, a musical phrase that appears in different forms throughout the soundtrack, always associated with characters who possess genuine virtues that have been corrupted or rendered destructive by circumstances beyond their control. This motif first appears in its purest form in Godwyn's theme, though we only hear it in corrupted, fragmented versions that reflect his current state as the Prince of Death. The same basic melodic structure appears in Radahn's theme, where it evokes his former glory as a hero and general, and in Morgott's theme, where it suggests the noble qualities that make his loyalty so tragic. The orchestration choices that unify the soundtrack reveal the composer's sophisticated understanding of the shared psychological territory that all these characters inhabit. Nearly every boss theme makes prominent use of brass instruments, but these instruments are consistently asked to play in ways that emphasize their limitations rather than their traditional associations with triumph and glory. French horns, normally the most noble-sounding instruments in the orchestra, are frequently muted or played in uncomfortable registers that make them sound strained and uncertain. Trumpets, traditionally associated with victory and celebration, often play in harsh, brassy tones that suggest corruption or perform fanfares that trail off into uncertainty rather than concluding with confident resolution. The harmonic language that runs throughout the soundtrack creates a sense of musical unity that reflects the shared cosmic circumstances affecting all the characters. Nearly every boss theme makes use of modal harmonies, chord progressions based on ancient scales that create feelings of timelessness and otherworldliness. However, these modal harmonies are consistently corrupted by the addition of chromatic notes and dissonant intervals that create feelings of instability and wrongness. This harmonic technique creates a musical representation of how cosmic forces have infected and corrupted the natural order of the world, affecting every character regardless of their individual virtues or intentions. Perhaps most sophisticatedly, the soundtrack employs a technique that might be called musical genetics, the way certain melodic fragments and harmonic progressions appear in multiple themes, but with variations that suggest family relationships, shared experiences, or common cosmic influences. The themes for family members often share melodic material, but these shared elements are always modified in ways that reflect each character's individual response to their circumstances. Morgott and Mohg's themes, for example, both incorporate musical elements that suggest their shared status as Omen twins, but these elements are developed in completely different directions that reflect their divergent responses to rejection and abandonment. The rhythmic connections between the various themes create another layer of musical storytelling that reinforces the game's exploration of duty, obligation, and the weight of cosmic responsibility. Many of the boss themes share similar rhythmic foundations, steady, march-like patterns that suggest discipline and dedication to purpose. However, these shared rhythmic foundations are consistently disrupted by syncopation, irregular accents, and tempo changes that suggest the way cosmic forces have made it impossible for anyone to maintain the kind of stable, purposeful existence that the rhythmic foundations seem to promise. The use of leitmotifs throughout the soundtrack creates a musical web of connections that mirrors the complex family relationships and political alliances that drive the game's narrative. Certain musical phrases associated with the Golden Order appear in various forms throughout multiple themes, but these phrases are always modified in ways that reflect each character's relationship to the institution. In Morgott's theme, Golden Order motifs appear in their most pure and reverent form, reflecting his genuine devotion to the system. In Rykard's theme, the same motifs appear heavily distorted and corrupted, reflecting his rejection of the Order's authority. In Godfrey's theme, these motifs appear in nostalgic, retrospective forms that suggest his complex relationship to an institution he helped create, but which eventually discarded him. The dynamic structures that unify the various boss themes create a sense of shared dramatic arc that reinforces the game's exploration of how individual tragedies contribute to larger cosmic catastrophes. Nearly every boss theme follows a similar pattern, beginning with deceptive calm or forced confidence, building through increasing complexity and intensity, reaching climactic moments that feel more tragic than triumphant, and concluding with resolutions that suggest exhaustion rather than victory. This shared dramatic structure creates a musical representation of how the cosmic circumstances affecting the lands between have created similar psychological pressures for all the major characters, regardless of their individual differences. The vocal elements that appear sporadically throughout the various themes create another layer of connection that suggests the shared humanity underlying even the most corrupted characters. When wordless vocals appear in boss themes, they often employ similar techniques, breathy, ethereal sounds that suggest both prayer and lamentation, both hope and despair. These vocal elements create moments of vulnerability and emotional transparency that remind us that beneath the cosmic powers and supernatural abilities, all these characters are struggling with fundamentally human needs for love, acceptance, and meaning. The ending of each boss theme contributes to a larger musical narrative about the nature of resolution and closure in a world where true peace seems impossible to achieve. Nearly every boss theme concludes not with traditional harmonic resolution that would suggest problems solved or conflicts definitively ended, but with various forms of ambiguous or suspended endings that leave listeners feeling that something important remains unfinished. This musical technique creates a sense of cosmic incompleteness that mirrors the way the shattering has left the entire world in a state of permanent crisis, where no individual victory can address the underlying cosmic problems. The tempo relationships between the various themes create subtle but important connections that reinforce the game's exploration of how time and history shape individual destiny. Many of the themes share similar basic tempos, but they employ different rhythmic subdivisions and accent patterns that create the impression of characters moving through the same historical moment at different psychological speeds. Radahn's theme, for example, often feels like it's moving too slowly, as if time itself has become a burden for someone carrying cosmic responsibilities. Malenia's theme frequently feels like it's fighting against its own tempo, as if she's struggling to maintain control over forces that want to accelerate beyond her ability to manage. The use of silence and musical space throughout the soundtrack creates another form of connection that speaks to the shared experience of loss and emptiness that defines the post-shattering world. Nearly every boss theme includes moments of unexpected quiet, sudden drops in orchestration, or pauses that feel longer than they should. These moments of musical emptiness create an auditory representation of the voids left by the various tragedies that have shaped each character's existence, while also suggesting the larger emptiness that has infected the world since the breaking of the Elden Ring. The acoustic qualities shared by many of the recording techniques used throughout the soundtrack create a sense of musical environment that reinforces the game's gothic, melancholy atmosphere. Many of the themes are recorded with significant reverb and echo effects that make the music sound as if it's being performed in vast, empty spaces, cathedral-like acoustic environments that once might have been filled with worshippers or celebrants, but now echo only with the sounds of conflict and sorrow. This acoustic treatment creates a musical representation of how the grand spaces and institutions of the lands between have been emptied of their original purpose and meaning. The orchestration techniques that appear throughout multiple themes create musical connections that suggest the shared cosmic influences affecting all the characters. The frequent use of extended instrumental techniques, strings played with unusual bowing methods, brass instruments played with exotic mutes, percussion instruments used in non-traditional ways, creates a consistent sense that the normal rules governing musical expression have been altered by the same cosmic forces that have altered the normal rules governing existence in the lands between. Perhaps most remarkably, the way musical themes transform and develop throughout their respective encounters creates a larger narrative about the nature of corruption and the loss of identity under cosmic pressure. Nearly every boss theme begins with musical material that suggests the character's original nature or former glory then subjects that material to various forms of distortion, fragmentation, or corruption that mirror the character's psychological or physical transformation. This shared pattern of musical decay creates a soundtrack-wide meditation on how cosmic forces systematically destroy individual identity and agency. The cultural and historical musical references embedded throughout the various themes create connections that speak to the shared heritage and common origins of the various characters. Many of the themes incorporate musical elements that suggest medieval or Renaissance musical traditions, modal scales, counterpoint techniques, and instrumental combinations that evoke earlier historical periods. However, these traditional musical elements are consistently modified by more modern compositional techniques that create feelings of temporal displacement and historical rupture, suggesting that all the characters exist in a state of disconnect from their own cultural origins. The emotional arc created by experiencing the boss themes in sequence throughout a complete playthrough creates a musical journey that mirrors the player's psychological journey through the game's narrative. Early boss themes, like Margit's and Godrick's, establish the musical vocabulary and emotional framework that will govern the entire soundtrack. Middle game themes like Radagon's and Rennala's deepen and complicate the emotional territory established by the earlier pieces. Late game themes like Malenia's and Morgott's bring the emotional complexity to its peak. The final themes for Radagon and the Elden Beast provide not resolution, but a sense of cosmic transcendence that places all the individual tragedies in a larger context. The collaborative art of musical tragedy, the creation of Elden Ring's soundtrack, represents one of the most successful collaborations between composers, sound designers, and game developers in the history of interactive media. The musical themes we've examined don't exist in isolation, but were created as integral parts of a large artistic vision that includes visual design, narrative structure, and interactive gameplay. Understanding how the music functions within this large artistic framework reveals the sophisticated level of planning and coordination required to create musical experiences that enhance rather than merely accompany the game's other artistic elements. The relationship between musical themes and visual design in Elden Ring demonstrates a level of artistic integration that elevates both elements beyond what either could achieve independently. Each boss arena is designed with acoustic properties that complement the musical themes associated with that encounter. The vast, echoing spaces where we encounter Radahn are designed to emphasize the lonely, mournful qualities of his theme, while the intimate, corrupted chambers where we face Mohg create acoustic environments that intensify the unsettling, claustrophobic aspects of his musical characterization. The lighting design for each encounter works in harmony with the musical themes to create unified emotional experiences. The golden, fading light that illuminates the Radahn encounter creates a visual equivalent to the nostalgic, twilight qualities of his musical theme. The harsh, artificial lighting in Mohg's palace creates a visual representation of the corrupted luxury that his theme expresses musically. The ethereal, moonlit atmosphere of Rennala's encounter provides a visual counterpart to the delicate, otherworldly qualities of her musical characterization. The pacing and structure of each boss encounter are carefully designed to complement the emotional arc of the associated musical theme. The multiple phases of the Malenia fight, for example, are timed to coincide with the musical development of her theme, ensuring that her physical transformation into the goddess of Rote occurs at the moment when the music reaches its most intense and transformative passage. This level of coordination between gameplay structure and musical development creates experiences where the interactive and artistic elements reinforce each other, rather than competing for the player's attention. The integration of musical themes with the game's broader narrative structure demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how music can function as a storytelling device, rather than mere atmospheric enhancement. The way boss themes reference and quote each other creates a musical narrative that parallels and enriches the game's textual and visual storytelling. Players who pay attention to these musical connections gain access to layers of meaning and emotional understanding that are not available through any other aspect of the game's design. The technical achievement represented by the soundtrack's production demonstrates the resources and expertise required to create musical experiences of this sophistication. The orchestral performances were recorded with multiple microphone configurations to capture different acoustic perspectives that could be blended in post-production to create the specific emotional effects required by each theme. The use of extended instrumental techniques required musicians with specialized training and experience, while the complex orchestration demanded careful attention to balance and texture that could only be achieved through multiple recording sessions and extensive post-production work. The way the musical themes interact with the game's dynamic audio system represents a significant technological achievement that enhances the emotional impact of each encounter. The music doesn't simply play from beginning to end, but responds to player actions, enemy behaviors, and environmental conditions in ways that create unique musical experiences for each playthrough. This dynamic approach to musical implementation ensures that the emotional power of the themes remains fresh and impactful even after multiple encounters with the same boss. The influence of Elden Ring's musical approach on the broader video game industry suggests that these compositions represent not just individual artistic achievements, but contributions to the evolution of interactive media as an art form. The sophistication of the musical storytelling demonstrates possibilities for how music can function in interactive contexts that extend far beyond traditional concepts of background music or atmospheric enhancement. Future game developers will likely study these compositions not just for their individual qualities, but for their innovations in musical integration and emotional design. The psychology of musical memory, the lasting emotional impact of Elden Ring's boss themes extends far beyond the immediate experience of playing the game, creating musical memories that continue to evoke complex emotional responses long after players have completed their journeys through the lands between. This phenomenon of musical memory demonstrates the power of well-crafted compositions to become permanently integrated into our emotional landscape, serving as triggers for recalled experiences and feelings that can be accessed through musical association. The specific musical techniques employed in each boss theme are designed to create what psychologists call episodic memory consolidation, the process by which specific experiences become integrated into our long-term memory in ways that preserve not just factual information, but emotional context and sensory detail. The use of distinctive instrumental combinations, unique harmonic progressions, and memorable melodic fragments ensures that each theme creates a distinct musical signature that becomes permanently associated with the emotional experience of that particular encounter. The repetitive nature of boss encounters in video games creates ideal conditions for the formation of strong musical memories. Players typically hear each boss theme multiple times during the process of learning and eventually defeating each encounter, creating multiple opportunities for the music to become deeply embedded in memory. However, the dynamic and variable nature of each encounter ensures that the musical experience never becomes completely predictable, maintaining the emotional freshness that keeps the music psychologically engaging rather than merely familiar. The way boss themes evolve and develop throughout each encounter creates musical narratives that mirror and enhance the psychological journey of learning to overcome challenging obstacles. The music literally becomes the soundtrack to personal growth and achievement, creating positive associations between the emotional content of the compositions and the satisfaction of overcoming difficulty through persistence and skill. This psychological connection between musical experience and personal accomplishment helps explain why video game music can evoke such powerful emotional responses years after the initial gaming experience. The emotional complexity of Elden Ring's boss themes creates musical memories that can support multiple layers of psychological processing and interpretation. Unlike simpler musical experiences that might evoke single emotions or straightforward associations, these compositions contain enough harmonic and melodic complexity to reward repeated listening and continued emotional exploration. Players often discover new emotional layers in familiar themes when they encounter them in different psychological states or life circumstances. The use of musical techniques associated with specific emotional states ensures that each boss theme becomes connected to fundamental psychological experiences that transcend the specific context of the game. The melancholy that permeates Radagon's theme, for example, connects to universal human experiences of loss and the passage of time, while the internal conflict expressed in Morgott's theme speaks to psychological struggles with self-worth and loyalty that many people face in their own lives. These connections between game-specific musical content and universal emotional experiences help explain why video game music can feel personally meaningful, even to listeners who have never played the games. The social and cultural dimensions of musical memory create additional layers of meaning around Elden Ring's boss themes. Players often share musical experiences with friends, family members, or online communities, creating collective memories and interpretations that enrich the individual's psychological impact of the compositions. The music becomes not just a personal soundtrack, but a shared cultural artifact that can evoke memories of social connections and community experiences related to gaming. The future of musical storytelling in games. The innovations in musical storytelling, demonstrated by Elden Ring's soundtrack, point toward exciting possibilities for the future of how music can function in interactive media. The sophistication of the musical characterization, the integration of themes with gameplay mechanics, and the emotional depth achieved through careful attention to harmonic and orchestral detail suggest that video game music is evolving into an art form capable of achievements that rival traditional musical composition in complexity and emotional impact. The success of Elden Ring's approach to musical storytelling will likely influence future game developers to invest more resources in sophisticated musical composition and integration. The demonstrated power of music to enhance emotional engagement and create lasting psychological impact suggests that musical excellence can contribute significantly to the commercial and artistic success of interactive entertainment. We can expect to see more games that treat music not as background atmosphere, but as integral storytelling element. The technical innovations required to create Elden Ring's dynamic musical experiences point toward future developments in adaptive audio technology that could make musical responsiveness even more sophisticated and emotionally effective. Future games might feature musical systems that can respond not just to player actions and environmental conditions, but to biometric data, emotional states, and individual psychological profiles that could create truly personalized musical experiences. The collaborative artistic processes that created Elden Ring's soundtrack suggest models for future cooperation between musicians, game developers, and other creative professionals that could lead to even more integrated and sophisticated artistic experiences. As the video game industry continues to mature as an artistic medium, we can expect to see more projects that bring together talents from different creative disciplines in ways that create new forms of artistic expression. The educational implications of Elden Ring's musical achievements suggest that these compositions could serve as teaching tools for future composers, game developers, and musicians interested in exploring the possibilities of interactive musical storytelling. The techniques and approaches demonstrated in these compositions provide concrete examples of how traditional musical composition can be adapted and enhanced for interactive contexts. The cultural impact of Elden Ring's musical achievements extends beyond the gaming community to influence broader cultural conversations about the artistic potential of interactive media. The sophistication and emotional depth of these compositions demonstrate that video games can serve as vehicles for artistic expression that deserve serious critical attention and cultural recognition. Conclusion: the eternal echo of digital tragedy. As our journey through the musical landscapes of Elden Ring's boss themes draws to a close, we find ourselves fundamentally changed by the experience of listening deeply to these masterful compositions. What began as an exploration of how music accompanies video game encounters has revealed itself to be something far more profound, a meditation on the nature of tragedy itself, expressed through the universal language of music in ways that transcend the boundaries between interactive entertainment and high art. The composers of Elden Ring understood that music possesses unique power to communicate emotional experiences that resist expression through words or images alone. In crafting themes that capture not just the external characteristics of each boss encounter, but the internal psychological states of beings caught in cosmic circumstances beyond their control. They created compositions that function as musical empathy engines, allowing us to feel the weight of cosmic responsibility, the pain of rejection and abandonment, the tragedy of noble intentions corrupted by circumstance, and the melancholy of power that brings no satisfaction. Each boss theme we've examined serves multiple functions simultaneously, as accompaniment to interactive challenge, as character study expressed through musical means, as contribution to a larger narrative about the nature of power and corruption, and as standalone musical composition capable of evoking complex emotional responses, independent of any gaming context. This multi-layered functionality demonstrates the maturation of video game music as an art form capable of achievements that equal and sometimes surpass the emotional impact of traditional classical composition. The lasting impact of these musical experiences extends far beyond the immediate context of gaming entertainment. The themes become part of our personal emotional soundtracks, musical keys that can unlock memories and feelings associated not just with the specific encounters they accompanied, but with the broader life experiences we were having during the periods when we first encountered them. In this way, video game music functions as a form of musical autobiography, marking significant moments in our personal development, with compositions that can transport us back to specific psychological states and emotional experiences with remarkable precision and power. The technological and artistic innovations represented by Elden Ring's soundtrack point toward a future where interactive media can serve as a platform for musical experiences that rival traditional concert halls and recording studios in their emotional sophistication and artistic ambition. The integration of musical composition with interactive gameplay creates possibilities for emotional engagement that are unique to the medium and impossible to replicate through any other form of artistic expression. The collaborative nature of these musical achievements reminds us that the most powerful artistic experiences often emerge from the successful integration of multiple creative disciplines working in harmony towards shared artistic goals. The composers, musicians, sound designers, game developers, and countless other creative professionals who contributed to these musical experiences demonstrate the potential for collaborative artistic creation that transcends traditional boundaries between different creative fields. The universal themes explored through these musical compositions, the nature of power and responsibility, the price of noble intentions, the tragedy of circumstances beyond individual control, the complexity of family relationships under cosmic pressure, connect the specific narrative content of Elden Ring to broader human experiences that give the music relevance and emotional impact that extends far beyond gaming culture. As we conclude our exploration of these musical territories, we carry with us not just analytical understanding of compositional techniques and orchestral choices, but emotional memories of journeying through soundscapes that revealed new dimensions of empathy and understanding. The music has served as our guide through landscapes of digital tragedy, teaching us to hear the humanity that persists even in the most corrupted and monstrous forms, the nobility that can coexist with failure, and the beauty that can emerge from the most heartbreaking circumstances. The boss themes of Elden Ring stand as monuments to the power of music to transform entertainment into art, challenge into emotional experience, and digital interaction into profound human connection. They remind us that in an age of technological advancement and digital innovation, the most powerful tools for creating meaningful human experiences remain the ancient arts of melody, harmony, and rhythm, musical languages that speak directly to the heart without need for translation or explanation. In the vast concert halls of digital space, where orchestras exist only as data and performances happen in virtual realms, these compositions prove that the human need for musical beauty, emotional expression, and artistic transcendence finds ways to manifest regardless of the medium. The tragic heroes and fallen gods of the lands between have found their voices through music that will echo long after the last console has been powered down and the final server has gone offline. The melodies of their suffering have become part of our emotional heritage, musical gifts that enhance our capacity for empathy and deepen our understanding of the complex relationships between power, responsibility, love, and loss that define the human condition. In learning to hear their stories through music, we have also learned to hear our own stories more clearly, recognizing in their digital tragedies the universal struggles that shape all conscious existence. And so, as the final notes of our exploration fade into the peaceful silence that follows great music, we rest, knowing that we have been touched by artistic achievement of the highest order. The composers of Elden Ring have created more than video game music. They have crafted musical prayers for the fallen, symphonic elegies for the corrupted, and harmonic meditations on the eternal questions that define conscious existence in a universe indifferent to individual suffering, but made meaningful by individual love. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers in these musical landscapes. May your rest be filled with the echoes of digital symphonies that remind us why we create art, why we tell stories, and why we continue to reach toward beauty, even in the face of inevitable tragedy. The music plays on, eternal and unchanging, a testament to the human capacity to transform suffering into beauty and isolation into connection through the mysterious alchemy of organized sound. Until we meet again in other musical realms, other digital landscapes, where composers dare to explore the deepest questions of existence through the ancient magic of melody and harmony. The boss themes of Elden Ring have shown us what is possible when technology serves art rather than replacing it, when innovation enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for emotional truth. In the silence that follows, we hear the echoes of their tragic beauty, and we are grateful